It began on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I'd left work a little later than usual, the skies overcast, and the city's hum blending into a low, constant murmur. I decided to take the scenic route home, a familiar shortcut through an old part of town. As I walked, I noticed a peculiar detail. The storefronts, the lampposts, even the sidewalks seemed to shimmer for a split second, like a frame glitching in an old video. I blinked, and everything appeared normal again. I chalked it up to my tired eyes and pressed on. Later that evening, back in my apartment, I tried to relax by watching a movie. About halfway through, I swore the scene repeated itself. The same line of dialogue, the same gesture from the actor, as if the film had skipped back a few seconds and started over. I paused the movie and rewound it, but the playback was perfectly linear. My heart pounded for a moment as I questioned whether I'd imagined it. Still, an unsettling feeling lingered. The next morning, on my way to work, I encountered something even stranger. I saw my friend Lisa waiting at our usual coffee shop. She waved, but when I greeted her, her smile faltered, and she looked at me as though she'd never seen me before. "Hi," she said curtly, before hurrying away. I couldn't shake the odd expression on her face. Later, I ran into a neighbor in the elevator, a person I'd exchanged pleasantries with countless times, and he simply stared blankly, as if he couldn't remember our previous encounters. It was as though familiar people were acting out of character, their usual quirks replaced by an eerie indifference. That evening, I returned to my apartment and began noticing small but unmistakable changes. A book I'd left on the coffee table was now on the shelf, though I was sure I hadn't moved it. The pattern on the rug near the door looked subtly altered, as if a few lines had shifted position. I checked my phone's photo gallery from earlier in the day. In one picture, taken in the park, a lamppost in the background had a neon glow, an impossible hue for the dying light of dusk. I compared it with a mental snapshot of how things should be and felt a growing disquiet. Over the next few days, the phenomenon intensified. I began to experience moments where time itself felt warped. At the grocery store, I paused in an aisle, only to feel as if I'd been standing there for an eternity before snapping back to reality. When I looked at my watch, it seemed to have skipped ahead inexplicably, as though several minutes had vanished. I even caught sight of a delivery truck idling on the street for what felt like hours, only to see it pull away moments later when I blinked. Each incident, while individually minor, accumulated into a sense that reality was not as fixed as it once had been. One night, I sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker, when I witnessed something that left me breathless. A man in a dark coat, someone I recognized from the coffee shop, stood on the sidewalk below, staring directly up at me. I distinctly remembered him leaving the shop moments before. Yet there he was, in a place he shouldn't have been. When I stepped back from the window, the figure was gone, as if he had never existed at all. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a mere lapse in perception, but a cold dread seeped into my bones. I began documenting every odd occurrence in a journal. I scribbled down times and locations, descriptions of shifting objects, encounters with familiar faces who now wore unfamiliar expressions. No one would believe me if I told them. Colleagues laughed off my stories, and even close friends suggested I was overworked or stressed. But I couldn't ignore what I was experiencing. The glitches, the rewinding of moments, the inexplicable reordering of my surroundings. It all pointed to something beyond a simple lapse of memory. One particularly unnerving evening, I was alone in my apartment when I heard my door click shut. I distinctly remembered leaving it ajar when I returned from the store. My heart hammered as I approached cautiously, only to find it exactly as I'd left it, a single, faint click resonating in an otherwise silent corridor. When I stepped outside, the hallway was dark and deserted, yet I felt as if I were being watched from every corner, as if some unseen force was rearranging my reality piece by piece. Now, as I sit here writing these words, I cannot shake the overwhelming sense that the world I once knew has been tampered with, glitched, as if it were a simulation that has begun to falter. Each day brings a new anomaly, objects subtly moving, moments repeating in a loop, and people I know behaving as if their memories have been edited out. I'm left questioning if these occurrences are mere coincidences born of stress and fatigue, or if they are signs of something far more sinister, a breakdown in the fabric of reality itself. I've started to wonder if I'm the only one who sees the cracks, or if perhaps the rest of the world is too blinded by routine to notice the glitches in the matrix. The more I try to understand, the deeper I sink into uncertainty. Every time I reach for a logical explanation, reality slips further away, like pixels in a corrupted file. I now live with the constant fear that something has changed fundamentally, that I am trapped in a version of the world that has been altered, rearranged by forces beyond my control. I can't tell if I'm a passive observer or an unwilling participant in something that's breaking down at the seams. And as the days blur together in a maddening loop of déjà vu, I'm left with one haunting thought. Maybe the truth is that reality itself has become nothing more than a glitch, and I'm caught in its endless, inexplicable cycle. I got home from work on a damp Tuesday evening, the city's lights reflecting off puddles on the pavement. The moment I stepped through my apartment door, everything seemed as it always had been, untouched, familiar. I set down my bag and went straight to the kitchen. There, on the table, sat my favorite mug, exactly as I'd left it that morning. It wasn't out of place. It was a comforting constant in an otherwise unpredictable day. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the drizzle blur the neon glow of the street below. At first, I brushed off the feeling that something was off as exhaustion, but as the hours passed, little inconsistencies began to pile up. When I returned to the kitchen after a shower, the mug was still on the table, exactly where I had seen it earlier. I distinctly remembered having moved it to the counter just before showering, yet now it was back in its original spot, as if silently replaced. I fumbled with my thoughts, questioning whether I'd forgotten or simply misremembered. Still, a seed of unease had been planted. The next day, while walking to work, I noticed a peculiar car parked along the same stretch of road, one I was positive I hadn't seen there the day before. It was a vintage sedan, its faded paint catching the morning light, parked almost too perfectly as if deliberately placed. At lunchtime, as I strolled past the same block, there it was again, parked in the same spot, as if the morning had replayed itself. I paused, heart pounding, and even called out to a passerby. "Did you see that car?" The stranger only shrugged, as if it were an ordinary occurrence. The anomalies continued to accumulate. At home, I found that the arrangement of items on my desk subtly changed from one day to the next. A stack of papers would be neatly aligned one morning, and by evening, they'd be slightly askew, as if an unseen hand had nudged them. I started jotting down these observations in a notebook, trying to anchor myself in details that I could verify. I wrote, "Mug returns to original spot, car appears twice in one day, papers rearranged." Yet every entry felt like it was repeating a pattern I could not break, a pattern that hinted at a loop I wasn't consciously part of. One night, as I sat in my living room reading, the clock on the wall caught my eye. Its minute hand seemed to jerk backward before resuming its course, as if time itself had hiccuped. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The clock was moving normally now, but the unsettling sensation lingered, as if the fabric of my day had been subtly altered without my consent. I began to notice the same faces in unexpected places. A colleague I'd seen only once during a coffee break would appear in the hallway on my floor, nodding at me with a faint, almost mechanical smile. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence, a mix-up of schedules in our small building. But then I started seeing the same stranger in the grocery store, always near the same aisle, as if he were an extra in a scene that was repeating itself. Each encounter was fleeting, a brief moment of recognition that vanished as quickly as it came, leaving me with a growing sense that I was caught in a loop where the script was being rewritten behind my back. I attempted to rationalize these glitches, faulty memories, fatigue, the randomness of urban life. But deep down, I felt that something was orchestrating these events. It wasn't just that objects or people reappeared. It was the precise way they did so, the same exact positions, the same sequence of events, as if reality were a recording on repeat. I began to question whether I was the only one noticing these patterns, or if I had simply become too attuned to the subtle irregularities of an otherwise stable world. The more I observed, the more I felt as if I were no longer a passive observer. I started to feel the weight of an invisible presence, a glitch in the matrix that manipulated the minutiae of everyday life. In quiet moments, when the city was hushed and I was alone in my apartment, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow passing over the wall, a reflection in the window that didn't match my own. Sometimes, I'd wake up with the sensation that I had spent hours somewhere I couldn't remember, as if parts of my day had been excised or looped without warning. One rainy evening, as I sat at my kitchen table contemplating these strange occurrences, I found myself staring at the mug again. It was exactly where it had always been, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was part of a larger, carefully orchestrated design. A creeping realization settled over me. Perhaps nothing in my world was accidental. Every misplaced object, every repeated encounter, every glitch in time was a thread in a tapestry that I couldn't comprehend. I wasn't just witnessing these anomalies. I was living within them. Now, as I write these words, I sit in a room that appears unchanged, yet every detail feels off, as though I'm trapped in a simulation where the normal rules of reality no longer apply. I have come to the disturbing conclusion that my life might be nothing more than a series of programmed loops and predetermined glitches. I can no longer trust my memories, my senses, or the familiar order of things. The more I try to grasp what is real, the more I feel the pull of an unseen system guiding every moment. I'm beginning to wonder if it even matters, if the reality I once knew was ever truly real at all, or if I have become a pawn in a much larger, incomprehensible construct. And so, I confront the unsettling possibility that I may never return to the normal life I remember, for I have become part of the glitch, entangled in a cycle that might never break. I always kept them in the same place, on a small wooden tray by the door. It was a habit I never broke, something I did unconsciously. So the first time they weren't there, I assumed I had been careless. Maybe I had tossed them on the counter or left them in my bag. I spent 20 minutes searching before I finally found them on my nightstand. It was odd, sure, but I shrugged it off. Then it happened again, and again. At first, it was just my keys, then my wallet, my phone charger, a book I had been reading, always small things, always items I used daily, and always turning up in places I was certain I hadn't put them. It was annoying more than anything, like my own mind was betraying me. I started keeping notes, a little checklist in my phone, just to reassure myself that I wasn't losing it. Keys in the tray, wallet, left on the kitchen counter, book, nightstand. The next morning, the book was in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the sink. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. I lived alone. No one had been in my apartment. I checked my door, my windows, all locked. I told myself I must have absent-mindedly moved it. Maybe I had been reading in bed and carried it with me without thinking. But as the days went on, the changes became more unsettling. I started waking up to find my closet doors slightly open. I always closed them before bed. I couldn't sleep otherwise. But every morning, just a crack. Barely noticeable, like someone had been peeking out and forgotten to close them all the way. One night, I took a picture of my bedroom before going to sleep, just to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. When I woke up, the doors were open again. I checked the picture. They had been shut tight. I started feeling like I was being watched, not in the way that makes you glance over your shoulder, but something deeper, more primal, a feeling that settled in my bones, that made my skin crawl when I sat alone in my apartment at night. Then the notes started changing. I always kept my checklist updated, making sure to mark down exactly where I placed things. One night, before bed, I noted, keys tray, wallet counter, bookshelf. The next morning, the text had been altered. Keys tray, wallet counter, book where it belongs. I stared at my phone for a long time. My hands felt numb. I hadn't written that. I hadn't changed it. I checked my apartment again, searching for signs that someone had been inside. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. But I felt it. Something had been there. I stopped keeping the checklist. It wasn't helping. Instead, I started trying to stay awake at night. I'd sit on the couch, TV on for background noise, eyes scanning the apartment. Waiting. But sleep always won in the end, dragging me under no matter how hard I fought it. And then one night, I woke up standing in my kitchen. The lights were off. The room was silent. My bare feet were cold against the tile. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no recollection of moving. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. Then I looked down. My phone was sitting on the counter, screen lit up. A note was open, the cursor blinking. "You found me." I backed away, so fast I nearly knocked over a chair. I grabbed my phone, scanning the room like something was about to lunge at me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I had typed it in a half-awake state. Maybe I had been sleepwalking, maybe stress was getting to me. I deleted the note, cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, as if that would somehow erase whatever was happening. That night, I slept with the lights on, and for a while, things were quiet, until I started noticing the marks. Small, thin scratches on my furniture, my walls, like something with nails had been tracing along the surfaces. I hadn't noticed them before, but once I did, I saw them everywhere. Along the edges of my nightstand, across my bathroom mirror, on my bedroom door near the handle. And then, the last straw. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed something in my reflection. The scratches on the mirror. They weren't random. They weren't just mindless marks. They formed letters. A single word, repeated over and over. Mean it. I left that night, packed a bag, locked the door behind me, and checked into a motel. I told myself I just needed a break, that I'd come back when I felt less paranoid, when I had time to clear my head. But I never did. I broke my lease a week later. I paid the penalty fees without a second thought. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't even tell anyone why I was leaving, because deep down I knew. Whatever had been in that apartment didn't want my things. It wanted me. It started with a simple mistake. I had just moved into a new apartment. Nothing special, just a quiet little place on the third floor of an old complex on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the walls were thin, the hallways smelled faintly of mildew, and the elevator creaked like it was on the verge of giving up. I didn't mind, though. It was cheap, and after a rough year, I just wanted a fresh start. A few nights after I moved in, I got a package that wasn't mine. It was sitting outside my door when I got home from work, a plain brown box with no return address. The label had my apartment number, but the name on it was someone I didn't recognize, E. Calloway. I figured it was a simple mix-up, so I planned to drop it off with the building manager the next day. That night, just as I was getting ready for bed, there was a knock at my door. Not the friendly, casual kind. This was slow, deliberate. I hesitated before looking through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. Whoever was out there was standing just out of view. I didn't open the door. After a long pause, I heard it, a voice low and hoarse. "That's mine." Chills ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. A pause. Then the same whisper. "Calloway." Something about the way they said it sent ice through my veins. I didn't respond. After a few tense moments, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. The next morning, I went to the building manager's office with the package, but before I could even explain, she shook her head. "No one named Calloway lives here," she said, barely looking up from her paperwork. I blinked. "Are you sure?" The package was right outside my door. She sighed, finally meeting my eyes. "I've worked here for 10 years. Trust me, there's no Calloway." I left the office unsettled. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe I had misread the name. Either way, I figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of my front door rattling. My heart slammed against my ribs as I bolted upright, ears straining. The lock held, but the door handle twisted back and forth, slow and methodical. I reached for my phone to call the police, but as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence. I stayed awake until dawn, jumping at every creak and shadow. When I finally got the nerve to check outside, the hallway was empty. But there, right in front of my door, was the package. Untouched. That was when I started feeling watched. At first, it was just a feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck, the unshakable sense that someone's eyes are on you. Then it became more obvious. Walking to my car, I'd catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye. A figure in the stairwell, a shadow behind the mailboxes. Each time I turned to look, no one was there. The worst was the elevator. One night, after a long shift at work, I stepped in and hit the button for the third floor. The doors slid shut. I leaned against the wall, exhausted, waiting. Then, just as the doors began to close, something wedged between them. A hand. My breath caught as the doors opened again, revealing a man. He was tall, unnervingly thin, dressed in a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. He stepped inside without looking at me, then turned to face the doors, standing so close it was almost unnatural. I swallowed hard. "What floor?" I asked. No response. The air in the elevator felt heavy, suffocating. I gripped my phone in my pocket, every muscle in my body coiled with tension. As the elevator rose, the man exhaled a slow, shuddering breath. Third floor. The doors opened, but he didn't move. I stepped out quickly, forcing myself not to run. The hallway was empty. As I fumbled for my keys, I finally glanced back. He was still in the elevator, still facing forward. But just before the doors closed, his head tilted slightly toward me. That night, I barricaded my door with a chair. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager again. "I need to report someone," I said, pulse still racing. Tall guy, black hoodie. "He followed me onto the elevator last night." She frowned. "No one's reported anything like that before." I clenched my jaw. "Can you check the security footage?" She hesitated. I can look, but I don't think we'll find anything." I didn't like the way she said that. A few hours later, she called me down to the office. Her face was pale when I arrived. Without a word, she turned the monitor toward me and hit play. The footage showed me entering the elevator just like I remembered. The doors began to close. And then, nothing. No hand stopping the doors. No tall man in a hoodie. No one stepping inside. I watched, my blood running cold, as the doors opened on the third floor. I stepped out alone. The doors closed behind me. I felt sick. "That's not possible." The building manager swallowed, then quietly turned off the monitor. "You should move," she said. I left the office in a daze. The hallways, the stairwell, even my own apartment suddenly felt different, wrong. Like the walls weren't just walls anymore, like something was watching from just beyond them, waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my skin crawl. And at exactly 3 a.m., I heard it again. A knock at my door. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. A whisper, barely audible through the wood. "That's mine. I don't live there anymore." I moved into the new apartment in early March, thinking it was just a fresh start after a long period of uncertainty. The building itself was old but charming. A narrow brick facade, creaking wooden floors, and a quiet courtyard that felt like a hidden retreat in the middle of the city. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I spent the first few days unpacking, arranging my few belongings just the way I liked, and taking leisurely walks around the neighborhood. I even met a couple of friendly faces. A cheerful neighbor named Linda, who always waved as she watered her plants in the courtyard, and a man I later learned was named Mark, who lived on the floor above me and seemed to be a quiet, reserved sort. The first odd occurrence happened a week into my stay. I was returning home after a late shift when I noticed something off about my living room. I had left my favorite armchair in its usual spot by the window, but when I turned on the light, it was missing. I searched every corner of the room, even the hallway outside, but it was as if it had vanished into thin air. I convinced myself I must have moved it in a moment of exhaustion and dismissed it as a one-off mistake. However, over the following days, similar inexplicable changes began to accumulate. A book that I was sure I had left on the coffee table was later found neatly placed on a shelf. My keys, which I always left on a small tray near the door, were sometimes found on the kitchen counter instead. Each time, I'd pause, feeling a flicker of doubt about my memory, but I told myself it was nothing more than a lapse in my usual absent-mindedness. Then came a series of encounters that unsettled me far beyond mere misplacement of items. One afternoon at the local grocery store, I bumped into Mark again. I remembered him as the quiet neighbor from my building, but this time his eyes were strangely distant and his smile didn't reach them. When I greeted him, he mumbled something about not recognizing me, as though I were a stranger. I laughed it off as a fluke, a momentary lapse, or perhaps a side effect of my fatigue. But later, when I mentioned the odd interaction to Linda in the courtyard, she hesitated before saying, "Oh, you mean Mark? He's always been a bit different lately." Her tone was light, but her words made my skin crawl. Things escalated slowly, but unmistakably. I began to notice subtle changes in my routine that I couldn't explain. I would step into my apartment at the end of the day and find the room arranged just a few minutes differently than I remembered. Once, I discovered a note taped to my refrigerator that read, "Don't forget," in handwriting that wasn't mine. I asked around, but no one admitted to leaving it. Even Linda, who was usually so forthcoming about little things, insisted she hadn't seen anything unusual. As the days passed, my initial skepticism turned into a creeping sense of dread. I started questioning if my mind was playing tricks on me or if something else was truly altering my environment. Late one night, I was alone in my apartment, trying to sleep, when I thought I heard soft footsteps outside my door. I sat bolt upright in bed, listening intently. The sound stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was just the building settling or a stray animal, but the feeling of being observed lingered long after I had forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found muddy footprints near the door, a clear sign that someone or something had been there. I called the building manager, but he brushed it off as a stray cat or perhaps a prank. Still, the more I sought answers, the less I found. Then there were the conversations with people I thought I knew. At a neighborhood barbecue, a longtime friend remarked that I had mentioned plans for a vacation that I had absolutely no recollection of discussing. At work, a colleague said I had offered to help with a project on a day I was sure I'd been home recovering from a cold. My own memories began to feel unreliable, as if details were being erased or rewritten while I slept. I started to keep a detailed journal, documenting every small anomaly, every misplaced item, every odd conversation. But even the entries in my notebook seemed to contradict themselves on occasion. Dates overlapping, events repeating with minor differences, as if my days were being replayed with subtle alterations. The turning point came one rainy evening when I returned home from work. I opened my door to find the familiar hallway bathed in the harsh glow of a single overhead light that I didn't remember turning on. My heart pounded as I stepped inside and saw that my living room, usually filled with the comforting clutter of my life, was eerily empty. The armchair was gone again, and a strange symbol had been drawn on the wall in what looked like charcoal, an intricate pattern that sent a shiver down my spine. I took a photo, but when I looked at it later on my computer, the symbol was barely visible, as if it had been erased by some invisible force. In that moment, the cumulative weight of all these inexplicable events became too much to bear. I realized I wasn't just dealing with an overactive imagination or a series of coincidences. Something far darker was at work, something that I couldn't control or even begin to understand. I felt like I was trapped in a closed loop, a distorted reality where the very fabric of my world was being altered without my consent. I began to fear that my life, every memory, every moment, was being rewritten by an unseen hand. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being drawn into something inescapable, a reality that seems perfectly ordinary to everyone else, but is gradually becoming alien and hostile to me. I can't find anyone who shares my experience. Every time I try to explain, I'm met with polite smiles and dismissive comments. And so I'm left with a lingering, terrifying thought. These changes aren't random accidents. They're deliberate, part of a larger, unexplainable phenomenon that's slowly consuming my world. I don't know how much longer I can live in a place where every day feels like a revision of the one before, where nothing is certain and everything I trust might be an illusion. One thing is clear, I'm no longer safe, not because of a physical threat, but because the very ground beneath my feet is shifting in ways that defy logic. And I fear that, in time, I may be forced to confront the unthinkable truth that my reality has been hijacked by something far beyond my understanding, and I may never be able to reclaim the life I once knew. I woke up on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning, the familiar sound of my alarm cutting through the quiet of my small apartment. As I rolled out of bed, I reached for my phone on the nightstand and noticed that its wallpaper, my favorite landscape, had been subtly altered, the colors slightly off, as if someone had tweaked the saturation. I shrugged it off as my imagination and went about my routine. In the kitchen, while waiting for the coffee maker to finish its gurgling cycle, I noticed the sugar bowl was now filled with salt. I stared at it for a moment, heart thumping, before convincing myself that I must have mixed them up in a sleepy haze. On my drive to work, the familiar streets of my neighborhood seemed to shimmer ever so slightly as I passed, like the digital artifact of a misaligned pixel. I could have sworn I had seen the same stranger, a man in a navy peacoat, standing on the corner just a few minutes earlier, though I'd never noticed him before. His face was calm, almost knowing, and as I passed, he gave me a slight nod. I blinked, and he was gone. At the office, the oddities continued. I walked into the lobby, and the receptionist, who always greeted me with a warm smile and a cheerful good morning, offered only a vague, almost robotic nod today. I asked her if everything was all right, but she simply said, "Morning," in a tone devoid of any real inflection, as if I were speaking to a recording. At my desk, I discovered that the arrangement of my personal items had shifted. My stack of files, which I was sure I had left neatly organized, now lay in a different order. Even the digital clock on my computer appeared to be a minute behind the network time, an inconsistency I chalked up to a technical glitch. Lunchtime brought further disquiet. I sat in the break room and struck up a conversation with a colleague about a movie we both loved. He recounted details of a discussion we supposedly had last week, though I was certain we had never spoken about it before. His eyes held a glimmer of amusement, as if he were in on a secret I wasn't privy to. I left the conversation unsettled, my mind reeling at the thought that my recollections could be manipulated without my knowledge. On my way home, I took my usual shortcut through the park, a path I had walked countless times. Today, however, the park felt subtly rearranged. The bench where I always sat was now painted a different color, and the cluster of trees that once formed a comforting canopy now appeared oddly sparse, as if someone had pruned them in haste. I paused at a familiar intersection, watching a delivery truck idling for what felt like an eternity, only for it to speed away as soon as I blinked. The repetition of these small anomalies began to erode the boundary between what I knew and what I experienced. Over the next few days, these glitches in reality grew bolder. In my apartment, I would come home to find objects displaced. A book that should have been on the coffee table, now resting on the windowsill. My keys mysteriously shifted to the kitchen counter. At times, I would even catch my reflection in the mirror and see it lagging just a fraction behind my movements, as though the image were buffering before it caught up with me. I started keeping a journal, meticulously noting every instance, every minute detail that didn't quite add up. Yet, as I wrote, the entries began to reveal contradictions. A day I recalled vividly didn't match the photos I had taken. Conversations I was sure-eyed were never mentioned again by those around me. One evening, I returned home to find my living room dimly lit, the ambient glow of streetlights filtering through a window that I distinctly remembered being closed. As I set my bag down, the room around me seemed to shudder imperceptibly, as if reality itself were rebooting. I approached the window and saw my own reflection. For a moment, it smiled at me, a smile I was sure I hadn't worn. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then came the final, irrevocable moment. I was sitting at my desk late one night, scrolling through the entries in my journal, when I noticed the words "glitch detected" appearing, seemingly typed out on their own at the bottom of the page. My hands trembled as I realized that the text wasn't something I had written. It was inserted, as if by an unseen hand. I tried to close the notebook, but the pages wouldn't budge, as though they were glued to the surface. The overhead light flickered, and for a brief second, I felt as if the room were dissolving into static. In that moment, a deep and dreadful certainty took root in my mind. I had become part of something that was unraveling the fabric of reality, a glitch in a matrix that I could no longer ignore. Now, as I sit here in the flickering glow of my computer screen, every familiar object around me subtly altered, I understand that I may never return to the normal reality I once knew. Every day, the small inconsistencies multiply, blurring the line between what is genuine and what is fabricated by forces beyond my comprehension. I have become entangled in this endless loop of repetition and inconsistency, trapped in a reality that has broken down at the seams. And with each passing moment, I grow increasingly convinced that I am not the anomaly. I am the glitch. It started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon at the little cafe on the corner where I sought refuge from a sudden downpour. I had settled into my favorite seat by the window, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, when I first noticed him, a man in a dark, unremarkable coat sitting at a nearby table, his gaze fixed on the rain outside. At first, I assumed he was simply lost in thought like I was, but as I sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were following me even when I looked away. I dismissed it as nothing more than a passing oddity, an innocent coincidence born of an overactive imagination on a dreary day. A few days later, I found myself at the local grocery store. Wandering the aisles with my shopping list clutched in my hand, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure in the produce section. There he was again, the same man, browsing slowly, as if he were meticulously choosing every apple. I paused for a moment, heart thudding with a sudden burst of recognition and unease. Could it be the same person from the cafe? I told myself it must be a coincidence. After all, he looked like an ordinary fellow, nothing particularly out of the norm. Yet, as I left the store, a shiver crawled up my spine, and I couldn't shake the impression that I was being observed. Over the next several weeks, the strange occurrences escalated in frequency and intensity. I began noticing him in places, and at times when I least expected it. On a park bench during an early morning jog, at the bus stop waiting for my ride home. Even across the street from my apartment building in the fading glow of twilight. Each time, his presence was fleeting, a brief meeting of eyes, a half-smile that never reached his gaze, a nod that felt simultaneously friendly and ominous. I tried to convince myself that it was all mere coincidence, that perhaps I was simply hypervigilant in a city where everyone's routines overlapped. But the mounting evidence made it impossible to ignore. One cool autumn evening, as I waited for the bus under a flickering street lamp, he approached me directly. His steps were measured, and his smile was warm enough to disarm any immediate suspicion. "Nice night, isn't it?" he said in a soft, unassuming tone. I managed a polite nod, but his next words sent a jolt of discomfort through me. "I feel like we've met before. Maybe somewhere around here," he mused, his eyes locking onto mine with a familiarity that was both unsettling and invasive. I mumbled a vague reply and tried to step away, but his presence clung to me like a shadow that refused to vanish. By the time the bus pulled up, he had melted into the night, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every creak and whisper in the darkness set my nerves on edge. I began keeping a small notebook, jotting down the dates, times, and locations of each encounter. I even started taking photos of places where I felt his presence lingered, always a blurred figure in the background, always just out of focus. The more I documented, the more I felt as if I were trapped in someone else's meticulously planned narrative. My once mundane life was slowly being overshadowed by an inexplicable fixation. I found myself scanning every face in the crowd, every passerby on the street, desperately searching for the telltale sign of his return. Then came the incident that shattered any remnants of rationality I had clung to. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to my apartment to find a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph of me, taken from a distance that allowed for a glimpse of a figure standing behind me. The image was grainy, yet I could make out the unmistakable outline of the man who had haunted my days. The note on the back simply read, "I'm closer than you think." That night, Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every shadow in my room transformed into the possibility of his looming presence. Since then, my world has narrowed into a cycle of anxious anticipation. I now change my route home, avoid my usual haunts, and double-check every lock on my door. Yet, no matter how carefully I try to evade him, the sense of being tracked persists. At times, I catch him casually leaning against a building, almost as if he's waiting for me to pass by. At other times, I receive small, cryptic gestures, a friendly wave from across the street or a nod in a crowded hallway that send my heart into a frenzied rhythm of fear and disbelief. I'm left wondering if this is all in my head, if the mind's ability to spiral into paranoia has cast a veil over my perception of reality. But every encounter, every calculated coincidence, chips away at that comfort. I've spoken to friends about it, but their reassurances only deepen my isolation, as if I'm trapped in an obsessive plan that no one else can see. The image of his persistent, searching eyes haunts me every time I step outside, making me question whether the man is truly a harmless stranger or the orchestrator of a much darker fate. Now, as I write these words in the dim light of my apartment, I am plagued by a final, unnerving question. Is this relentless series of coincidences merely the product of an overactive imagination? Or am I being stalked by someone whose intentions remain utterly unfathomable? Every time I think I've eluded his gaze, I catch a glimpse in a reflective window or in the rearview mirror of a passing car. I cannot escape the feeling that he is always one step behind, silently waiting in the periphery of my life. And so, as I lie awake, heart pounding with the dread of unseen eyes, I am forced to confront the unsettling possibility. Is it all just coincidence? Or is someone truly watching me? Their purpose as mysterious as the shadows that now follow me everywhere. It started with something so small, I almost didn't notice. I'd been living in my little apartment for over a year, a modest space in an old building that I'd come to love for its quiet charm. One night, after a long day at work, I returned home and immediately sensed that something was off. I'd left my keys on the small ceramic bowl by the door, but tonight they were missing. I searched everywhere, on the counter, on the table, even near the couch where I sometimes absent-mindedly set them down. Eventually, I found them on the windowsill, as if they'd been gently placed there by an unseen hand. I chalked it up to a momentary lapse in memory, convinced I must have carried them out and forgotten to put them back. Yet something about that rearrangement nagged at me. The next few days brought more inexplicable shifts. I'd set down a book on the coffee table one evening, only to find it the next morning propped up against the lamp. At first, I told myself I must have moved it in my sleep or while half awake, but the movements were too deliberate, almost as if the objects were being rearranged with a purpose. One morning, I discovered faint smudges on the wall near my desk, marks I'd never seen before. They looked like tiny scratches, almost like claw marks, but I couldn't fathom how they'd gotten there. When I mentioned it to a friend over the phone, they urged me not to worry, suggesting I was just imagining things due to stress. But deep down, I knew that wasn't all there was to it. Then came the nights when I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sensation of being watched prickling my skin. I'd lie in bed, eyes wide in the dark, convinced I heard the soft, irregular scuffing of footsteps in the hallway. I'd muster the courage to get up and check, only to find nothing but the familiar silence of my building. However, on one occasion I swore I saw the reflection of a face in the mirror, just for a split second, right behind me. When I spun around, the room was empty, and the mirror bore only my own pale, frightened expression. My attempts to put the pieces together only deepened my unease. I began keeping a journal, documenting every oddity. The misplaced keys, the books that moved, the inexplicable marks, and even the moments when time itself seemed to warp. There were days when I would leave for work at my usual time, only to return home and find that the clock on the wall had inexplicably advanced by several minutes, as if hours had slipped away unnoticed. Conversations with neighbors and friends became strained when I mentioned these events. Each one insisted that nothing had changed, that my apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Their reassurances rang hollow against the steady barrage of small, unnerving alterations. One particularly disconcerting incident occurred when I was setting the table for dinner. I distinctly remembered placing a bowl of fruit on the sideboard, but when I went to retrieve a glass, the bowl was no longer there. Instead, I found a single apple sitting on the counter, its skin marred by a series of fine, almost deliberate scratches. The marks were arranged in a pattern that hinted at some hidden message, though I couldn't decipher what it meant. I called my landlord, expecting perhaps a prank or a simple mistake, but he assured me that no one had been in the apartment. The sense that something else was at work grew heavier with each unexplained occurrence. I started to feel that I wasn't just dealing with random mishaps. There was a pattern to it all. The changes weren't chaotic. They were precise, methodical even, as though someone or something was slowly rewriting my reality. I would catch fleeting glimpses of the same stranger outside my window, a person who always seemed to be watching but never approached. On a few occasions, I saw this figure standing in the corridor, only to vanish when I stepped out to look. It was as if the world around me was slipping into a loop, a control glitch that I couldn't fix. Late one night, after a day filled with these subtle disturbances, I returned to my apartment to find that the layout had changed entirely. My furniture was not where I remembered placing it. My couch had been moved to the far wall, and a side table that once sat next to my bed now occupied a spot in the living room. I searched desperately for any sign of how this rearrangement could have happened, but everything was as pristine as ever. No evidence of forced entry, no signs of a prank. I felt trapped in a nightmare of shifting surroundings, and every time I tried to put the pieces together, I ended up with more questions than answers. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, an environment that should be familiar but now feels alien and unsteady, I'm left with a haunting question. Is it all in my head? Could these small glitches be the product of my own fractured perception, amplified by stress and sleepless nights? Or is there something else at work, something far more sinister than I ever imagined? Every unexplained change, every mysterious mark, feels like a breadcrumb leading to a larger, unexplainable truth. I've come to dread the moments when I step away for a while, only to return and find that even the most mundane details have been altered. It's as if reality itself is being subtly rewritten, and I'm powerless to stop it. I still don't know what is causing these anomalies. No one else seems to notice, or perhaps they choose not to, leaving me isolated with the unsettling feeling that something is watching, waiting for the next glitch to reveal itself. Whether it's my own mind playing tricks on me or some external force reshaping the world around me, I can't shake the fear that I'm on the edge of a deeper, more disturbing reality, a reality that might be nothing more than an elaborate illusion. And as I lie awake at night, listening to the silence that hides too many secrets, I'm left to wonder, was it all just my imagination? Or is there something more behind these inexplicable events? It started with a lost time. At first, it was just a few seconds here and there, moments where I'd blink and feel like the world had jumped forward a beat. I'd check my phone and see that a minute had passed when I could have sworn it had only been a second. I brushed it off as exhaustion, stress, the mind's way of skipping over the mundane. It was nothing, until it wasn't. One evening, I was sitting on my couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when I got up to get a glass of water. The next thing I knew, I was standing in my bathroom, staring into the mirror, the faucet running. My mouth was dry, and I had no memory of walking there. I looked at my reflection, searching for some sign that I had just spaced out, but my own face felt unfamiliar. The way my shoulders were slightly hunched, the blankness in my expression. It was like I had caught myself in a moment I wasn't supposed to see. That night, I hardly slept. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were fragmented and unsettling. Shadows moving behind my eyelids, voices whispering in a language I didn't understand. And when I woke up, my phone was in my hand, my alarm disabled, and my browser open to a page I didn't recognize. An article about sleepwalking. I didn't remember searching for it. Over the next few days, things escalated. I'd find myself standing in rooms I didn't remember walking into, holding objects I didn't recall picking up. My handwriting Something I'd always recognized as distinctly mine started to look different in my notes at work, as if someone else had written them. My coworkers would reference conversations we'd had that I had no memory of. A woman in the break room asked how my weekend trip had been. I hadn't gone anywhere. The worst part was the feeling. A constant, creeping sensation just beneath the surface of my thoughts, like something else was there with me, nudging me forward, subtly shifting my decisions. I would find myself speaking words before fully forming the thoughts, turning left when I'd meant to go right. Small things I could explain away until I couldn't. One night, I woke up outside. The cold concrete of my apartment building's stairwell pressed against my bare feet, the heavy steel door shut behind me. I had no idea how long I had been standing there, but my phone was in my pocket, open to my call log. I had dialed a number I didn't recognize, and the call had lasted exactly 6 minutes and 32 seconds. The number wasn't in service. I barely slept after that. I started setting up my phone to record audio while I slept, hoping to catch some explanation. The first few nights, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of blankets, my own uneven breathing. But on the fourth night, I heard it. A voice. Not mine. It was quiet, almost indistinguishable from the background noise. But it was there. Words whispered in the dark. I played the clip over and over, trying to make sense of it. But the more I listened, the more wrong it felt. The voice wasn't speaking in any language I knew, but it was familiar. Too familiar. Like something imitating the way I sounded. That was when I realized something else. I had started dreaming in a language I didn't understand. I'd wake up gasping for breath, the foreign syllables still on my tongue, slipping away before I could hold on to them. But in those brief moments, right before I fully woke, I knew what they meant. I just wasn't supposed to. People around me started changing, too. A barista I'd chatted with for months acted like she had never seen me before. My neighbor, who always waved when we passed in the hall, avoided eye contact now, her smile stiff, unnatural. My boss, normally indifferent to everyone, started asking me strange questions. "Do you feel like yourself today?" he asked once, his head tilted slightly, as if he was studying me. I laughed it off, but the way he nodded, like I had given the right answer, made my stomach twist. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Stress, lack of sleep, paranoia feeding into itself. But then, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I got a text from myself. It was from my own number, sent at 3:14 a.m. Just 2 words. Almost ready. I stare at the screen, my pulse hammering in my throat. I hadn't sent it. I checked my phone logs, my messages. Nothing showed that I had typed those words. But it was there, clear as day. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The final straw came when I woke up sitting at my desk, my laptop open, a document on the screen filled with line after line of the same phrase, over and over. I am awake now. I don't remember typing it. I don't know how long I had been sitting there. I deleted the file, shut my laptop, and left my apartment. I drove for hours, no destination in mind, just putting as much distance between me and whatever was happening. But even now, as I write this from a hotel room miles away, I can feel it. That presence, that wrongness, like something is waiting for me to stop running, like something has already decided what happens next. And worst of all, I can't shake the feeling that, whatever it is, I let it in. I used to work the night shift at a small gas station off a lonely stretch of highway. It wasn't an exciting job, but it paid the bills, and for the most part, my nights were uneventful. Truckers stopping for coffee, the occasional lost traveler asking for directions, and the same few locals coming in for cigarettes or beer. Nothing out of the ordinary, but there was one night, one experience, that still sends a chill through me whenever I think about it. No matter how much I try to rationalize it, I can't explain what happened. It was late, probably around 2:30 a.m., when the automatic bell above the door chimed, signaling someone had entered. I had been restocking the fridge, and when I turned to greet the customer, I immediately noticed something was off. A man stood there, motionless just inside the doorway. He was tall, too thin, and wore a faded brown coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull, and his skin had this unhealthy, almost grayish hue. But what really unsettled me was the way he stared at me, like he was expecting me to recognize him. I forced a polite nod and asked, "Can I help you find something?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, head slightly tilted, like he was processing my words at a delay. The station was dead silent except for the hum of the refrigerators and the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Then, slowly, he started walking toward the counter. His movements were odd, too controlled, like each step was calculated. I tried again. "Sir, do you need help with something?" No response. Just that stare. I could feel my stomach tighten as my instincts screamed that something was wrong. I've dealt with my fair share of weird customers, drunks, drug addicts, people having mental episodes, but this was different. He wasn't swaying or mumbling. He was completely silent, watching me with an unnatural stillness. Then finally he spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "You shouldn't be here." My skin prickled. "Excuse me?" I asked, forcing a nervous chuckle. "I work here." He slowly shook his head. "No, you shouldn't be here." His voice was flat, almost mechanical, and something about the way he said it sent a wave of cold through me. Trying to keep my composure, I reached under the counter where the emergency button was located. "All right, sir. If you're not here to buy something, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For the first time, his expression changed. He frowned, just a tiny shift of his features, but enough for me to see something else lurking beneath his eyes. "Something wrong?" He leaned in slightly. "They're coming." That's when the lights flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to make my breath hitch. The man didn't react. He just kept staring. Then, the power cut out completely. The store was plunged into total darkness. My heart pounded. I fumbled for my phone, using the screen's glow to see, but the second I looked up, he was gone. The door hadn't opened. The bell hadn't chimed. He had just disappeared. I stood there frozen, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Then, as suddenly as the power had gone out, it flickered back on. The humming of the refrigerators returned. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything was exactly as it had been, except for the man. I checked the security footage the second my shift ended. The cameras had glitched the moment the lights cut out, leaving a gap of about 30 seconds. And before that, the footage showed me standing at the counter, talking, but I was alone. No man. No fadet bronco. Just me, looking terrified, speaking to empty air. I quit a few weeks later. I told my manager it was because of the long hours, but the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been in that station with me that night. Something I wasn't supposed to see. And to this day, I still don't know what he meant when he said they're coming. All I know is that when I drive past that gas station now, I make sure never to stop. I started noticing the little anomalies in my day-to-day life on what should have been an ordinary week. It began with trivial things. An extra cup on the counter that hadn't been there before. A door left ajar that I was sure I had locked. I blamed my tired mind and the chaos of settling into my new apartment, an aging building with creaky floors and long, echoing hallways. I told myself these were nothing more than coincidences, minor lapses in routine that would soon be forgotten. Over the next few days, the incidents grew incrementally stranger. I'd leave a book on the table only to find it later on the windowsill, as if someone had moved it overnight. At times, I caught a fleeting sound, a laugh, almost familiar, echoing down an empty corridor. Yet whenever I stepped out, no one was there. I began to suspect I was simply more sensitive than most, my imagination fueled by stress and fatigue. Still, a nagging unease settled over me that I couldn't dismiss. One evening while reading in the soft glow of a lamp, I noticed a figure in the reflection of a darkened window, a blurred outline of a person standing just behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, only to find the room empty. I reassured myself it was a trick of the light or a product of my imagination. But as the nights passed, these strange moments multiplied. Objects disappeared from one place and reappeared in another with no logical explanation. I began to document every occurrence. The exact time an item vanished, where it later turned up, the subtle background murmur that accompanied each incident. I even set up a small camera in my living room, hoping to capture evidence of a rational cause. But the footage revealed only static and elusive, shifting shadows. What unnerved me most, however, were the people. I started encountering individuals who felt oddly familiar. A man in a worn leather jacket nodding at me from across the street, a woman with kind, sorrowful eyes offering a quiet smile as if acknowledging an old friend. I had never met them before, yet their expressions conveyed a secret knowledge that sent chills through me. Once, when I mustered the courage to speak to one, he simply vanished into a bustling crowd, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling emptiness. Then came the voices. Late at night, when the world was hushed and I lay in bed, I began to hear soft murmurs that seemed to speak my name. At first, they were barely audible, a whisper beneath the sigh of the wind, but soon they grew clearer, forming words I couldn't fully decipher. I recorded these moments in a journal, trying to piece together a logical explanation. But every time I reviewed my notes, I found more questions than answers. Was it all the product of a frayed mind, or was something else at work? I started to question my own sanity. Each unexplained event, no matter how minor, chipped away at the foundation of what I considered real. I double-checked locks, retraced my steps, and even rearranged my furniture, hoping to find a pattern. Yet, the anomalies persisted with a relentless regularity. The apartment's walls seemed to breathe with hidden life. Shadows stretched in unnatural angles, and the soft hum of voices sometimes rose to a mournful chorus just as I closed my eyes. Over the past several weeks, sleep became a battleground between lucidity and the surreal. In the darkness before dawn, I would awaken drenched in sweat, heart racing as fragments of vivid dreams intruded upon waking reality. In these dreams, unfamiliar faces appeared, strangers with eyes full of sorrow and secrets, seemingly calling out to me from beyond. Their presence left me with an overwhelming sense of foreboding, as if I were meant to uncover something I was too terrified to understand. Now, as I sit here writing these words in the dead of night, I cannot tell if what I am experiencing is real or merely a construct of my unraveling mind. Every misplaced object, every inexplicable sound, every fleeting glimpse of a face I don't recognize haunts me, blurring the line between truth and delusion. I've tried to share my experiences with friends and even sought help from professionals, but they dismiss my accounts as stress-induced fantasies. Yet the evidence I've recorded, photos, audio clips, detailed journal entries, speaks for itself, even if it only deepens the mystery. I am left with an unsettling question. Am I losing my grip on reality, or is there something sinister orchestrating these events, lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary? As I write, a distant creak sounds in the hallway, and the chill of an unseen presence brushes past me. I cannot decide if this is the onset of a waking nightmare, or merely the product of my fevered imagination. In the end, the unanswered questions remain, echoing in the silence of my apartment, leaving me to wonder if what I have experienced is real, or if it is all just a figment of a mind slowly unraveling under the weight of uncertainty. I moved into my new apartment about 2 months ago, hoping for a fresh start after years of living in a cramped, noisy rental. The building was old, its hallways creaked underfoot, and the dim lighting gave every corner a sense of mystery. But it possessed a charm I couldn't resist. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary, until I met Daniel. I first encountered him on a brisk autumn afternoon in the narrow stairwell. As I lugged a box of groceries upward, I noticed him leaning casually against the wall, his eyes crinkling in what I assumed was a friendly smile. "New here?" he asked in a smooth, unhurried tone, and when I nodded, he complimented my choice of bags and even remarked that I must have an eye for quality. I laughed it off as simple, neighborly pleasantries, never imagining that this brief interaction would set off a series of events I'd later regret. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's presence became increasingly noticeable. Every time I left or returned home, I would catch sight of him lingering in the hallways or casually positioned outside my door. His greetings grew more frequent, and his questions, though polite, started probing a little too deeply, inquiring about my work, my family, even my favorite routines. One rainy evening, while I was watering the small potted plant on my balcony, He appeared unexpectedly at the railing. "I love the sound of rain," he commented, his voice soft yet oddly intense. "It washes away the past, don't you think?" I forced a smile and nodded, unsettled by the way his eyes seemed to search mine for unspoken answers. Subtle changes soon turned into disturbing anomalies. I began receiving text messages from an unknown number. At first, they were nothing more than benign remarks about the weather or compliments on my posts, signed simply with the initial D. Over time, though, the messages became increasingly personal, referencing details of my daily life that I never shared publicly. One morning, I awoke to find my front door slightly ajar, a door I was sure I had locked before bed. On the kitchen counter lay a note, meticulously written, "I hope you slept well." My pulse raced as I recalled a fleeting glimpse of Daniel standing across the street, watching with an intensity that defied normal neighborly concern. Then, one night changed everything. I was returning from a late shift when I noticed Daniel's car idling in the parking lot, a sedan I didn't recognize, parked deliberately close to mine. I slowed down, my eyes darting through the rain-soaked darkness, and saw him standing under a flickering street lamp. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on me as if he were measuring every move. I felt a surge of panic, my instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. I accelerated away, heart pounding so hard I feared it might burst through my chest. Yet the memory of his gaze lingered, a dark promise that this was far from over. In the days that followed, his behavior escalated in ways I could no longer dismiss as mere coincidence. At the local grocery store, while I was selecting produce, Daniel appeared out of nowhere at the end of an aisle. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, asking, "Do you ever feel like someone is always watching you?" His question, delivered with an unsettling mix of curiosity and menace, left me reeling. I hurried away, the fluorescent lights of the store flickering as if in silent disapproval of what I had just experienced. At work, subtle reminders of his presence haunted me too. Brief mentions of a Daniel in casual conversations, knowing glances exchanged among colleagues who insisted they hadn't noticed anything odd. It was as though I was the only one aware of a creeping intrusion into my private life. I began meticulously documenting every encounter in a battered notebook. I recorded the times I saw him, the precise words he used, even the way the light in the corridor seemed to dim when he was near. But the more I wrote, the more isolated I felt. Friends tried to reassure me, suggesting that I was simply overthinking harmless coincidences. Yet every new message, every unexpected meeting chipped away at my confidence in my own perception. The line between genuine concern and imagined paranoia blurred, leaving me suspended in a state of constant anxiety. Now, as I sit alone in the silence of my living room, I can still feel the weight of his unblinking stare, even if only in memory. I've changed my routines, taken different routes, and even rearranged my furniture in a desperate bid to reclaim a sense of control. Yet despite my efforts, the feeling that Daniel's presence lingers, like a shadow just beyond the edge of vision, remains stubbornly ingrained in every corner of my existence. I cannot be sure if I'm simply letting fear run rampant through my mind, or if this stranger's gentle facade masks something far more sinister. The question gnaws at me. Was I truly in danger? Or have I overestimated every subtle sign until they became monsters in the dark? Whatever the truth, one thought haunts me relentlessly. Daniel could be anywhere, and perhaps I'm not the only one who's felt the chilling thrill of being quietly observed. I first noticed something was off on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke up to the gentle patter of rain against my window, a sound that usually soothed me, only to find that one of my most trusted everyday routines had gone awry. I always kept my keys on a small hook by the door, a habit ingrained over years of living alone in my modest two-room apartment on the edge of town. That morning, in a rush to leave for work, I fumbled around the entryway only to discover the hook empty. I searched every nearby surface, the kitchen counter, the hallway table, even the coffee table in the living room, but my keys were nowhere to be found. I dismissed it as a careless oversight, a simple lapse in memory, and eventually found them later on the kitchen table, exactly where I remembered placing them. Yet that small incident left a lingering unease I couldn't quite shake. The day progressed in a rhythm that should have been familiar, but subtle anomalies began to multiply. At work, I overheard two colleagues whispering about a conversation they had supposedly shared with someone named Alex in the break room, someone I was certain had been with me that morning. When I mentioned it, they exchanged confused looks and insisted they'd never seen anyone by that name. I questioned my own recollection, chalking it up to a momentary distraction caused by the stress of the morning rush. Still, as I returned to my desk, I couldn't help but feel that a small piece of reality was missing, as if I were gradually being edged out of events I once fully participated in. Over the next several days, the peculiarities escalated. It began with little things. My favorite mug would disappear from its usual spot on my desk, only to reappear later in a different corner of my apartment, sometimes even half full of water that wasn't mine. I'd find items inexplicably rearranged, a book placed where it hadn't been before, a cushion turned to face the window as if inviting someone in. At first, I rationalized these occurrences as the product of my own absent-mindedness, or perhaps a trick of poor lighting and sleep-deprived imagination. But when I set up my phone to record a few nights in hopes of catching an explanation, I only captured brief moments of shifting shadows and muffled sounds that I couldn't clearly decipher. What unsettled me most, however, was the behavior of the people around me. Friends and neighbors whom I'd known for years began to act as if events I vividly recalled had never occurred. I remembered a lively conversation with my neighbor about the upcoming street festival, a chat filled with shared memories and laughter. Yet when I brought it up a week later, she hesitated and then claimed, "I don't recall that at all." Even strangers on the bus or in the grocery store would give me puzzled looks, their expressions betraying a sense of familiarity that I couldn't place. One evening, I distinctly recognized a man in a worn leather jacket walking down the street, someone who felt achingly familiar. I tried to approach him, to ask if we had met before, but he turned the corner abruptly, as if fleeing from an unwelcome reminder of my own existence. Desperation drove me to document every odd occurrence. I began a journal detailing the time and place of each disappearance, every misplaced object, and every conversation that felt as if it had been edited out of reality. I photographed my cluttered living room at different times of the day, only to compare the images and find slight but inexplicable differences, like a book that seemed to vanish from one shot and reappear in the next, or a window curtain that appeared to have shifted positions. I even recorded audio in hopes of capturing the soft, almost imperceptible murmurs that echoed in the late hours of the night. Each new entry deepened my confusion and paranoia, the line between memory and fabrication blurring with each passing day. Then came the day when the disturbances reached a crescendo. I arrived home from work to find my living room transformed. The furniture was rearranged into an almost ritualistic formation, with the couch facing directly toward the window and the clock on the wall ticking in an odd, counterintuitive rhythm. I reached for my phone to call someone, a friend, anyone, to confirm that what I was witnessing wasn't just another one of my hallucinations, but the line went dead as if severed by an invisible force. I pounded on the door of a neighbor, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, only to be met with blank stares and hurried, incoherent excuses. Their faces, once warm and familiar, now seemed distant, as though they were acting out parts in a play that had long since been written without my consent. Now, as I sit in the wavering glow of my desk lamp, I find myself questioning the very fabric of my reality. I review my journal, my photos, and my recordings over and over, searching for a logical explanation, a pattern, perhaps, that would ground these surreal experiences in reason. But every lead has dissolved into uncertainty. I wonder if these occurrences are the result of some malevolent influence outside of my control, or if I am, in fact, the unwitting victim of a mental unraveling so subtle that even those closest to me cannot see it. The growing sense of alienation is suffocating, and I feel less like an active participant in my own life and more like an observer watching someone else's story unfold. Tonight, as I hear the soft creak of the floorboards and catch a fleeting glimpse of a shadow that isn't mine, I am left with a final, burning question. Am I trapped in a reality that is slowly being rewritten around me? Or is my mind playing cruel tricks on my perception? The truth remains elusive, a puzzle with too many missing pieces, leaving me to wonder if I will ever reclaim control, or if I am destined to fade into the background of a life that no longer remembers me. I inherited the old farmhouse on the outskirts of a forgotten town, a relic left behind by a distant relative whose life was shrouded in mystery. When I first stepped onto the creaking porch, a chill ran down my spine, as if the house itself exhaled a long-held secret. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, and the silence was almost oppressive. I assumed the uneasy feeling was simply the burden of history and isolation. Yet from the very first night, I sensed that something was terribly wrong. It began subtly, a misplaced object here, a soft creak in the hallway there. I attributed these minor disturbances to my overactive imagination, amplified by the solitude of my new home. But as days passed, the incidents grew more disconcerting. One evening, while reading in the dim glow of a single lamp, I heard a quiet murmur from the room beyond. It was a voice, almost pleading, and it sent shivers through me. When I followed the sound, the corridor lay empty, its length stretching into darkness. The whisper had ceased, leaving behind only a lingering sorrow that I could not explain. Over the next several nights, the manifestations became increasingly invasive. I awoke to find muddy footprints leading from the back door to my bedroom, as if someone had wandered in during the night. At times, I caught fleeting glimpses of a pale figure lingering at the edge of my vision, always just beyond the reach of clear sight, vanishing when I turned to confront it. One particularly harrowing night, the temperature in the house plummeted without warning. I wrapped myself in blankets, yet an inexplicable, biting cold seeped into my bones. It was then that I discovered fresh, deliberate scratch marks on my arms, thin and precise, as though etched by invisible, resentful fingernails. Determined to understand the source of these occurrences, I immersed myself in the farmhouse's history. I spent countless hours combing through old town records, brutal newspapers, and forgotten diaries. I learned of a series of tragedies. A small child lost under mysterious circumstances, whispered accounts of a grieving spirit roaming the corridors, and unexplained deaths that were hastily dismissed as mere accidents. In the attic, hidden beneath layers of dust and neglect, I discovered an ancient leather-bound journal. Its pages, yellowed and fragile, chronicled the despair of a family tormented by forces unseen. One entry in particular sent a chill down my spine, a desperate plea warning that the sorrow of the lost could never be silenced. The diary ended abruptly, as if the writer had been forced to abandon it in a moment of terror. One stormy night, as rain battered the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, I sat in the parlor with the journal spread out before me. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows across the room. In that fleeting moment, I felt an overwhelming pressure, an unseen force that pressed upon my chest until breathing became a struggle. The candle sputtered wildly, and in its staccato glow, I glimpsed a small, gaunt figure at the foot of my bed. The figure's eyes, sunken and mournful, locked with mine for an eternity before vanishing into the darkness. I was left in a state of shock, the sound of soft, echoing sobs reverberating in my ears long after the apparition had disappeared. As the days turned to weeks, the presence within the house grew bolder and more insistent. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind through the broken windows seemed laden with intent. I began to record these encounters on my phone, but each attempt was thwarted by an eerie, low-frequency hum that distorted the recordings beyond recognition. Sleep became a scarce commodity as I found myself perpetually alert, haunted by the sensation of being watched. One particularly unsettling incident occurred on a moonless night when I awoke to the sound of persistent tapping at my bedroom window. With trepidation, I approached and discovered a single, muddy handprint smeared across the glass. The imprint was disturbingly human, yet I knew that no living person had visited me. In a desperate bid for answers, I reached out to a local historian, an elderly man who seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of the farmhouse's dark legacy. His eyes, clouded with years of sorrow, recounted tales of a family cursed by grief, of restless spirits doomed to wander the premises in search of solace. He spoke of a little girl, lost to the cruelty of fate, whose spirit was said to wander the halls, forever mourning her lost innocence. His words, laden with regret and fear, only deepened my own terror. I began to suspect that the house, with all its eerie manifestations, was a vessel for a profound, unyielding sadness, a darkness that seeped into every crevice of its ancient walls. Now, as I pen these words in the safety of my new, albeit temporary, refuge far from that accursed farmhouse, I am plagued by an unshakable sense of dread. Every creak in my current home reminds me of the whispers in the dead of night. Every shadow hints at the possibility of another lost soul seeking redemption. I have attempted to sever the bond with that place, yet the memories cling to me like a second skin. Tonight, as a frigid wind rattles the windows and a distant, childlike giggle echoes in the silence, I cannot help but wonder if the darkness from the farmhouse has followed me, a relentless specter determined to reclaim what it lost so long ago. The questions remain unanswered, the mystery unresolved, and in the quiet moments before sleep overtakes me, I am left with the unnerving certainty that some doors, once opened, are impossible to close. Even as I write these final lines, an inexplicable sensation crawls along my skin, a lingering presence that whispers of unfinished business and dark, uncharted corridors of memory. I have no certainty if what I experienced was the product of a tortured mind or a genuine encounter with the supernatural. The boundaries between reality and nightmare have blurred irreparably, leaving me with an ever-present question. Is the sorrow of the past destined to follow me into every shadowed corner of my existence? I fear that the answers, if they ever come, might only deepen the mystery, trapping me in a cycle of relentless, spectral torment. For now, I can only brace myself for the inevitable return of that mournful laughter, the ghostly hand that might one day knock upon my door, and the unyielding truth that some horrors are forever etched into the soul. Even now, as I struggle to make sense of these events, the lingering echo of that forgotten sorrow haunts me. In moments of quiet reflection, I feel the weight of unseen eyes and hear whispers that promise the darkness is far from over. I remain caught between terror and disbelief, forever tethered to a mystery that refuses to fade away. I first noticed it on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening. I returned home from work, exhausted but relieved to be back in my quiet apartment. As I opened the door, I expected the usual comforting familiarity. The worn couch in the living room, the potted plant by the window, and most notably, my favorite ceramic mug sitting on the small wooden table in the kitchen. I distinctly remembered placing it there that morning after breakfast. But as I set my bag down and made my way to the fridge, I caught a glimpse of the mug in the exact same spot, untouched, as if time had frozen for a split second. I shrugged it off, attributing it to a trick of my tired eyes. After all, hadn't I always left it there? The next day, I was in a rush to catch my train when something else struck me as odd. While waiting at the station, I noticed a black sedan parked across the platform, a car I could swear I hadn't seen there before. Its windows were tinted, its surface gleaming under the station's fluorescent lights. I passed it without a second thought, assuming it belonged to someone else. But on my walk home later that afternoon, I saw that same car again, parked on the same block, exactly as it had been earlier. Each time I encountered it, the sedan looked immutably the same, yet it was as if it had been there for hours without anyone moving it. At first, these occurrences were small, isolated incidents, barely enough to disturb the routine of my life. I began to notice other minor discrepancies. My favorite chair, which I always left by the window, would sometimes be found in a different corner of the living room, perfectly arranged as if it had never been moved at all. I started keeping a mental note of these things, thinking they were nothing more than coincidences. A misremembered detail here, a lapse in attention there. But then the patterns became too frequent, too deliberate to ignore. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, I found my digital clock on the wall flashing an odd sequence of numbers before returning to the correct time. I blinked and looked again, only to see the same sequence replaying in slow motion. The sensation was unnerving, a brief, surreal reminder that time might not be as linear as I believed. My journal entries, which I had taken to writing in order to document these oddities, began to reflect a growing sense of disquiet. I noted every instance. The mug that never left the table, the car that reappeared like a recurring ghost, the chair that shifted positions without a trace. I mentioned these incidents to a coworker, hoping for some rational explanation. "Maybe you're just tired," she said with a dismissive smile, "or it's all in your head." But her words did nothing to dispel the mounting feeling that I was no longer merely an observer in my own life, that something was subtly, yet inexorably, altering my reality. I began to wonder if I was caught in a loop, or perhaps a glitch in the fabric of existence itself. Late one evening, as I walked the familiar route back from a friend's dinner, I noticed something even stranger. At the corner of my block, beneath the flicker of a street lamp, I saw the same figure standing in the shadows. A man in a worn leather jacket, his face partially obscured by the darkness, who I was sure I hadn't encountered before. As I approached, he stepped into the light for a moment, enough to reveal a face that seemed both familiar and unrecognizable at once, and then melted back into the night. I couldn't tell if he was following me or if he was part of the scene repeating itself. The incidents began to feel orchestrated, as if every detail around me was being meticulously arranged by some unseen system. My neighbor started acting oddly as well. Mr. Carter from the apartment next door, usually gruff but predictable, greeted me one morning with a vague, almost mechanical smile and said, "Good morning, friend," as if he expected me to be there at that moment every day. When I mentioned I didn't recall our previous interactions in that tone, he simply shook his head and muttered, "Time has its own plans." His words echoed in my mind long after he left. I tried to piece together a logical explanation. Maybe I was experiencing stress-induced hallucinations, or perhaps my memory was failing me. Yet every time I looked around, the glitches seemed to confirm that something deeper was at work. I began to notice inconsistencies not only in my environment, but within myself. There were moments when I would find myself in places I couldn't remember arriving at, or I'd start a conversation only to realize I had already had it moments before, word for word. My sense of time grew unreliable. Days blurred together, and the line between reality and illusion became increasingly ambiguous. One night, after a particularly disorienting day, I sat in front of my computer and reviewed the photos I had taken throughout the day. In one series of images, I captured my desk at work, but in several of them, the arrangement of objects subtly shifted between shots. My coffee mug, my pen, even the reflection in my computer screen appeared slightly distorted, as if the scene were a series of overlapping frames from two different timelines. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Had I become trapped in a loop, or was my reality being rewritten piece by piece without my consent? The final blow came on a rainy afternoon. I was returning home when I passed the same black sedan once more. This time, I was certain it wasn't just a coincidence. I parked my car and walked to the front door, only to find it ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, half expecting to confront an intruder. Instead, I found everything exactly as I had left it that morning. The same mug on the table, the same arrangement of furniture. But then, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible detail. On the kitchen counter lay a single piece of paper, identical to one I had seen days before, with the words "Reset Complete" scribbled in hurried handwriting. In that moment, a horrifying realization dawned on me. All these glitches, these inexplicable repetitions and alterations, were not random coincidences. They were part of a system, a program, perhaps, that was rewriting my reality in real time. I was no longer merely observing. I was caught in the code, a variable in a simulation that had gone awry. Now, as I write this, I feel the ground shifting beneath me. Every familiar object, every person I once knew, might just be a placeholder in an elaborate loop that I can't break free from. I've come to confront the terrifying possibility that the world I've always believed in might be nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed facade designed to keep me complacent while the true nature of reality glitches beneath the surface. I don't know if it even matters anymore, whether I'm real or simply a line of code in an endless program. The comfort of normalcy has vanished, and as I stare at the same mug on my table, unchanged and yet inexplicably out of place, I can't help but wonder, have I become part of the glitch, trapped in a system that I can never truly escape? I used to wake up every morning with a sense of control, as if I owned each minute of my life. That all changed about 3 months ago when I started noticing things were off. Not because something bad was happening outside, but because something inside me felt manipulated. It began with small gaps in time. I'd go about my day, only to realize later that entire stretches of hours had slipped away without explanation. I'd find myself sitting in a cafe with a half-finished cup of coffee, unable to recall when I had arrived there, or I'd be at home, certain I'd been in one room, only to discover I had somehow ended up in another. It was as if my life was punctuated by invisible edits. At first, I chalked it up to stress or sleep deprivation. I told myself I must be misremembering things. But then people around me started to comment on my behavior. My best friend, Sarah, said I'd been acting strangely, even when I was alone. "I swear you were so animated yesterday," she mentioned during one of our calls. "And today you're like a robot. I don't remember you saying certain things last night." I insisted that I had no recollection of any odd conversation, that I was simply tired. But deep down, I began to feel a nagging suspicion that I wasn't in full control of my own actions. One evening, I came home from work and, exhausted, went straight to bed. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own skin. My thoughts were disjointed, and my movements seemed measured, almost mechanical. I found a series of sticky notes on my mirror in the bathroom. They were in my handwriting, or so I assumed, and read, "You're not alone, they know, and time is stolen." I couldn't recall writing them. In a moment of panic, I looked for fingerprints, but there was nothing unusual. As the day progressed, subtle changes accumulated. I noticed that when I spoke to colleagues at work, my words sometimes came out in a different tone, my voice lower and more detached, as if rehearsed. Conversations I remembered having were inexplicably altered when I recounted them later. I began to wonder if I was simply misremembering or if someone or something was tampering with my mind. The strangest part was the feeling that something was watching me from the inside, as if my thoughts were not entirely my own. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator or the distant traffic, and feel a presence lurking behind every thought. It wasn't an external shadow or a person peering in through the window. It was more insidious, a creeping sensation that my decisions, my actions, were being orchestrated by an unseen force. I would catch myself hesitating before picking up a pen, as if something was waiting for me to falter, to slip out of line. One afternoon, I decided to confront this terror by recording a video diary, hoping to catch some evidence of what was happening. I set up my phone on a tripod in my living room and began speaking about the lost hours and the alterations in my behavior. As I recounted my day, I suddenly paused, my eyes widening as I stared blankly ahead. For a moment, I forgot what I was saying entirely, then resumed as if nothing had happened. Watching the playback later, I saw my face change. There was a flicker, a brief moment where my expression was eerily calm and almost predatory. I had no idea that I was capable of such a transformation. Desperation drove me to seek help from a therapist, but even during our sessions, I felt an undercurrent of detachment. I would describe feeling like a puppet with its strings pulled by someone I couldn't see. The therapist listened intently, yet when I mentioned the peculiar incidents, the misplaced hours, the sticky notes, the altered memories, she gently suggested I might be experiencing a dissociative disorder. I knew what I was feeling was far too calculated, too precise, as if someone was deliberately erasing and rewriting my experiences. Then came the night that shattered any remaining semblance of normalcy. I woke up at 3:15 a.m. with a start, heart pounding in a cold, oppressive silence. I found myself standing in the middle of my living room, staring at the wall. A faint, rhythmic tapping emanated from somewhere deep within the structure, like the steady beat of a clock I hadn't set. I couldn't recall leaving my bed, yet here I was, frozen in a moment that felt both painfully familiar and terrifyingly alien. In that instant, I realized that the subtle manipulations were no longer limited to my memories. They were seeping into my very being. I wasn't just losing time, I was losing myself. Now, every day feels like I'm caught in a maze of half-remembered moments and actions that aren't truly mine. I wake up with fleeting flashes of control, only to later find that the day has unfolded in ways I cannot explain. The sense that someone or something is controlling my behavior from within persists like a constant cold presence. My friends tell me I'm overthinking it, that I'm just stressed, but they can't see the blank gaps in my memory or the uncanny detachment in my voice. They see a person who is functioning, but I know there's a hidden part of me being orchestrated by an unseen force. I've started keeping a detailed log, a desperate attempt to reclaim ownership of my life. Yet, as I write, I fear that these records might be rewritten as well, altered like the rest of my reality. I'm left with one harrowing thought. I may never truly understand what is happening, and I may never regain control over my own mind. Every time I close my eyes, I feel those invisible strings tugging at me, pulling me toward an unknown end. I don't know if I'll ever find the answers, or if my experiences are merely the product of an overactive imagination fueled by stress. But I can't shake the overwhelming sense that something is controlling me from the outside, guiding my every move and rewriting my memories. The reality I once trusted now feels like a fragile illusion, one that could be dismantled at any moment. And as I lie awake in the darkness, listening to the silent beat of that inexplicable tapping, I know one terrible truth. I may be trapped in a world where my very thoughts are no longer my own, and I will never be free from the feeling that I'm still being controlled from the outside. I moved into the small apartment on Maple Street in early October, eager for a fresh start after years of cramped living conditions. The building itself was modest, nothing fancy, a worn brick facade, creaky wooden floors, and a narrow hallway lined with faded paintings. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I spent my first few days unpacking, arranging my furniture just the way I liked it, and exploring the neighborhood with a sense of hopeful anticipation. A week into my new life, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, a kindly older woman who always greeted me with a warm smile. One afternoon, as I was returning from the local grocery store, she called out from her door, "Welcome to the building, dear. Don't be a stranger." I exchanged a few polite words with her and continued on my way, feeling that comforting sense of community. But later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I found a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a note written in neat, almost careful handwriting. "Keep your eyes open." I dismissed it as a harmless prank, perhaps left by someone with a mischievous sense of humor. Yet, the words unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Over the next few days, subtle changes began to puncture the veneer of normalcy. I noticed that my favorite mug, the one I always placed on the kitchen table, was sometimes found on the windowsill, even though I was absolutely sure I had left it in its usual spot. One morning, the layout of my bookshelf seemed altered. Books I distinctly remembered arranging by color were now in an order that made no sense. I tried to rationalize these discrepancies. Maybe I was simply forgetting my own habits, but a growing unease began to settle in my chest. Then, things took a darker turn. One evening, after returning from a late shift at work, I found the corridor outside my apartment strangely silent. As I passed by the other residents' doors, I saw a flicker of movement from behind a crack in one door. It looked as if someone was watching me, but when I knocked, there was no answer, only silence. That night, I dreamt of disjointed images, dark hallways, familiar faces that seemed distorted, and a pervasive feeling of being pursued by something unseen. I awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and couldn't shake the impression that I was being observed, even when I was alone. My encounters grew increasingly perplexing. At the local coffee shop, I began noticing a man in a gray jacket who appeared to sit in the same corner every day, reading the newspaper. One day, I realized that he had been sitting there for a week straight, his features unchanged, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. I tried to approach him, to ask if I had seen him before, but every time I mustered the courage, he would look up, nod politely, and then return to his silent vigil. It was as if he were part of the furniture, an unsettling fixture that I could neither ignore nor understand. Back at home, the environment itself seemed to shift imperceptibly. The wallpaper in my living room, once a comforting shade of blue, appeared slightly different each time I looked at it, darker, almost bruised, as though it were absorbing the tension of the space. One morning, I discovered faint, unexplained scratches along the baseboard, like someone had been trying to carve a message into the wood. I asked a friend to come over and confirm what I was seeing, but when she visited, she insisted everything looked perfectly normal. "Maybe you're just tired," she said, smiling in a way that made me feel dismissed and even more alone. My attempts to document these occurrences only deepened my anxiety. I started keeping a detailed journal, writing down every odd detail. The misplaced mug, the rearranged books, the silent gray-jacketed man, and the shifting colors of the wallpaper. Yet every time I reread my notes, the events felt surreal, as if I had witnessed them in a half-remembered dream. I even set up a small camera in my living room to catch any evidence of unexplained movement. One night, when I reviewed the footage, I saw a fleeting glimpse of a shadow moving across the room, a shape that wasn't mine, slithering along the wall in a way that defied logic. The most disturbing moment came one stormy night. Thunder rattled the windows as I lay awake in bed, listening to the rhythmic tapping of rain. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking echoed down the hall. I sat up, heart racing, certain that the door to my apartment, which I had locked before bed, was opening. I crept to the peephole and saw nothing, only the empty, dark corridor. But as I turned away, I noticed something on my nightstand. A single slip of paper with the words, "It's only the beginning," scrawled in the same neat handwriting as the earlier note. The message shattered any remaining semblance of normalcy I had clung to. Desperation and dread took hold. I tried to discuss these events with Mrs. Ellison and even the building manager, but each time I mentioned the changes or the inexplicable notes, I was met with dismissive shrugs and forced smiles. "You must be imagining things," they said, as if my growing terror was nothing more than a trick of the mind. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the cold eyes of that silent man at the coffee shop, the subtle rearrangements in my own home, and the eerie messages that hinted at something far beyond a simple prank. Now, as I write this in the solitude of my darkened apartment, every creak of the floor and every flicker of a light fills me with a paralyzing dread. I feel as though I'm trapped in a reality that is constantly shifting, a world where every familiar object could betray me at any moment by changing on its own. The people around me act as though nothing is amiss, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being drawn into something much larger and far more sinister than mere coincidence. I lie awake at night, wondering if I'm the only one who can see the fractures in this facade we call normalcy, and if so, what it means for my future. I fear that I'm not just experiencing random anomalies, but that I've stumbled into a dark and inexplicable phenomenon, a closed loop of reality where every comforting detail is a mask for something hostile lurking beneath. And in that realization, I'm left with a lingering, unanswerable question. Am I truly alone in perceiving these changes, or have I become the unwitting target of something that has been watching, waiting, and altering my life from the shadows? I moved into my apartment 3 months ago, excited by the promise of a fresh start. The building was old but charming, with high ceilings, creaky floors, and a courtyard that everyone said was the heart of the place. At first, nothing was amiss. Every day followed the same gentle routine. I arranged my furniture, placed my favorite mug on the kitchen table, and even marked the spot where the morning sun hit the living room just right. But then, one ordinary Tuesday, I noticed something subtle yet unsettling. I returned from work and, while unpacking groceries, saw that my mug was no longer on the table where I had left it. Instead, it sat on the windowsill, completely undisturbed, as if placed there by an unseen hand. I paused, blinked a few times, and chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness. Still, a small knot of unease began to form. The next few days brought more anomalies. I would walk into the living room and see my sofa exactly where it belonged, until I noticed it was angled a few degrees off from its usual position. My books, once neatly arranged on the shelf, were sometimes in a different order or even on the floor. I began to wonder if I was forgetting things or if someone else had been in my apartment. I mentioned it to my neighbor, a kindly older man named Harold, who had lived in the building for decades. "Oh, don't worry," he said with a slight smile. "This place has its quirks. You get used to it." But his tone was dismissive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. Then came the strangest change of all. One morning, while I was in the shower, I thought I heard a quiet, rhythmic tapping on the window. The sound was faint, almost like a distant knock, but persistent enough to draw my attention. I dried off and peered through the fogged-up glass, but all I saw was the reflection of a rainy street and my own anxious face. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or a trick of the acoustics, but deep down I felt that something was very, very wrong. At work, my unease only grew. Colleagues would casually mention details that seemed off, as if our shared memories had shifted without warning. One day, my coworker Lisa remarked that she remembered me ordering a double espresso last week, a conversation we never had. Another time, I overheard two colleagues discussing an incident that, according to them, had happened on the day I was on vacation. I tried to bring up these inconsistencies, but they only shrugged it off, smiling as though nothing were amiss. It was as if everyone around me was operating on a slightly different timeline, one that I couldn't sync up with my own. That feeling of isolation peaked one rainy evening when I came home early from work. The corridors of the building were dimly lit, and I felt an eerie quiet as I climbed the stairs. In my apartment, everything looked normal at first glance. The same faded wallpaper, the same familiar layout. But as I moved about, I realized that small details had changed. A framed photograph of a smiling family on my wall was now tilted at an odd angle, and the bookshelf in the corner now contained a book I didn't recognize, its cover a stark black. I flipped through it and found blank pages, except for a single sentence scrawled on one page. "You are not alone." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, feeling the oppressive weight of something lurking just beyond the veneer of normalcy. I texted Harold, asking if he'd noticed anything strange lately. His reply was swift, almost too calm. "It's just the building's old charm, nothing more." But his words did nothing to soothe me. I began to feel that the changes were not random accidents. They were part of a larger, inexplicable pattern that was slowly erasing the familiar reality I once trusted. Over the following weeks, the anomalies became more frequent and disturbing. I started finding small objects in places they had never been before. A pair of shoes I didn't own by my door, a key I didn't recognize on my coffee table. Even my phone's calendar began to fill with events I had no recollection of scheduling. At work, familiar faces would greet me with expressions that seemed off, their voices laced with a tone of familiarity that I couldn't place. Every time I tried to bring up these inconsistencies, people dismissed my concerns as mere stress or imagination. The final blow came one night when I sat at my kitchen table, trying to make sense of the journal I kept. As I flipped through the pages, I realized that some entries seemed to contradict each other. Details of my day that were rewritten as if the past itself had been altered. I looked up and noticed my reflection in the window behind me. For a split second, I saw not my own face, but that of a stranger, a gaunt, emotionless version of myself staring back, as if warning me. I froze, heart pounding, unable to determine if it was a trick of the light or something far more sinister. Now, as I write this, every time I glance around my apartment, I feel a creeping dread, a sense that everything familiar is slipping away into an alien, hostile landscape. I no longer trust my own eyes, nor do I believe anyone else can see the changes that haunt me. They say it's just my imagination, that I'm overreacting to minor oddities. But I know what I've experienced: the subtle shifts, the unexplainable messages, the altered memories. I fear I've become trapped in a world where reality is no longer fixed, where every object and every face could change in an instant, leaving me isolated in a universe that seems perfectly normal to everyone else. And as I sit here, heart heavy with uncertainty, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever reclaim the life I once knew, or if I am doomed to exist in this ever-shifting, unrecognizable reality forever. It started innocuously enough on a humid summer evening in a city far from home. I had spent the day in back-to-back meetings and decided to unwind by exploring the quieter parts of town. Wandering down narrow, lamplit streets, I found myself drawn to a small square where a street vendor sold trinkets and local treats. That's where I first met Marcus, a man with a calm demeanor and a warm smile, who struck up a conversation with effortless ease. He asked about my travels and even complimented the way I seemed to know my way around, as if I were a local. His words were friendly, his interest genuine, and in that moment, I chalked it up to the kindness of a stranger in an unfamiliar city. Over the following days, however, the chance encounters became less coincidental and more unnerving. I began to notice Marcus in unexpected places: a quiet corner cafe where I sought refuge from the relentless heat, the hotel lobby where I waited for a delayed train, and even the small park near my temporary apartment where I went for evening walks. Each time, his presence was fleeting: a nod from across the room, a half smile as he passed by, or a brief conversation about nothing in particular. At first, I convinced myself that the city was simply small and that I was bound to run into the same face more than once. Yet, the timing of these encounters grew strangely precise, as if orchestrated to coincide with moments when I was most vulnerable. Then came the unsettling details that I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while I sat alone in a crowded cafe with a book and a steaming cup of coffee, Marcus appeared at a nearby table. As he sipped his drink, he casually remarked that he'd noticed I'd taken a different route back to my hotel that morning, a change I hadn't mentioned to anyone. His tone was light, almost conversational, but the accuracy of his observation sent a chill through me. On another occasion, during a quiet evening at a bar, he mentioned something about a private conversation I'd had with a friend, details of which I had never shared with anyone outside that small circle. Each offhand comment, delivered with disarming normalcy, eroded my sense of privacy and left me questioning how much this stranger truly knew about me. My unease deepened with every subsequent encounter. It wasn't long before I began to document these moments in a small, worn notebook. I jotted down dates, times, and locations, each entry a testament to the slow, creeping invasion of my personal space. I even managed to snap a few photos on a whim, but Marcus always seemed to vanish before I could get a clear shot. More disturbingly, there were times when I caught sight of him standing a little too close on a crowded bus or leaning against a building just outside the route I had planned for my evening walk. His presence was constant, almost as if he were deliberately seeking me out at moments when I felt most exposed. Then came the night that shattered any lingering hope that this could all be coincidence. I returned to my apartment after a late meeting, exhausted and eager to forget the day. As I fumbled with my keys at the door, I noticed a small envelope tucked beneath it. My hands trembled as I opened it to find a single Polaroid photograph, a grainy image of me, taken from a distance as I sat at my desk, oblivious to the lens capturing my every move. On the back, in neat, deliberate handwriting, was a message that made my blood run cold. "I see you." The note was as enigmatic as it was ominous, and in that instant, I realized that Marcus's friendly facade had been nothing more than a prelude to something far more sinister. Desperate for answers, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Could it be that I was simply overreacting to a series of odd coincidences? I spoke to friends and even considered reaching out to local authorities, but each conversation left me feeling more isolated and misunderstood. Everyone insisted that running into the same person a few times in a small city was normal, and that my growing paranoia was a product of stress and unfamiliar surroundings. Yet every time I turned around, there he was, a shadow in the periphery, a reminder that I was being watched. Now, As I sit in the dim light of my apartment and reread the entries in my notebook, I can't help but feel that the line between chance and intent has blurred beyond recognition. I've altered my routines, taken different routes, and even avoided the usual places where I once felt safe. Still, Marcus's presence lingers like a dark specter, a constant reminder that someone might be tracking my every move. I search for logical explanations, a case of mistaken identity, a well-timed coincidence, but nothing fits. Every new encounter, every offhand comment about details only I would know, drives me deeper into a well of uncertainty and dread. So here I am, left with an unsettling question that refuses to fade. Is it all just a series of strange coincidences born from an overactive imagination, or am I truly being watched by someone whose intentions I cannot fathom? The thought that I might be part of someone's meticulously crafted plan haunts me every time I step outside, every time I glance over my shoulder in a crowded street. Until I find a rational explanation, the shadow of Marcus, and the possibility that I'm not alone in this, will continue to cast a long, menacing pall over my life. It started with my apartment, or at least I think it did. I can't be sure anymore. One evening, I came home from work like always. I dropped my keys on the little tray by the door, kicked off my shoes, and went to the kitchen to make dinner. I opened the fridge, reaching for the bottle of iced tea I always kept on the top shelf. My hand closed around it, but when I pulled it out, I froze. It wasn't iced tea. It was lemonade. That shouldn't have been strange. Maybe I grabbed the wrong drink at the store without realizing it. But the thing is, I hate lemonade. I never buy it. I never drink it. Yet there it was, sitting in my fridge as if it had always been there. I felt a strange unease settle in my stomach, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself I had just been absent-minded. I made dinner, watched TV, and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and reached for my phone on the nightstand. But it wasn't there. I always leave my phone in the exact same spot before bed. I checked under my pillow, the floor, even the dresser. Panic started creeping in when I finally found it, sitting on the kitchen counter. I had no memory of putting it there. I tried to laugh it off. Sleepwalking? Stress? Just me being forgetful? I went to work, let it go. But then I started noticing other things. The books on my shelf were out of order. My favorite mug had moved from its usual spot in the cabinet to the sink, even though I hadn't used it. And the worst part, when I went to put on my shoes, they weren't my shoes. They were the same brand, same color, same size, but they felt different. The soles were just a little too thick, the laces a shade darker. But no one else would have noticed. Only I noticed. I told my best friend, Nate, about it over lunch, expecting him to laugh and tell me I was being paranoid. Instead, he just frowned. "You've been acting weird lately," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I don't know. You say things that don't make sense. Like yesterday, when you said you hated sushi." I blinked at him. "You don't hate sushi." He gave me an odd look. "No, you don't. We get sushi together all the time." I felt a slow, creeping dread rise in my chest. "No, we don't." Nate just shook his head. "Forget it. Maybe you're just tired." But I wasn't tired. Something was wrong. I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange thing that happened. By the end of the week, I had filled several pages. Friday, TV remote moved. I always put it on the coffee table, but it was under the couch. Saturday, my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, waved at me and called me David. My name isn't David. Sunday, found a jacket in my closet I've never seen before. My size, my style, but not mine. The more I tried to make sense of it, the worse it got. One night, I woke up to a strange sound, a faint scratching at my bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat as I lay frozen in bed, heart pounding. I told myself it was just the wind, but my apartment was on the 3rd floor. I forced myself to get up, open the door. Nothing. But the next morning, I noticed deep, thin scratches on the wood, like something had been trying to get in. I showed them to my landlord. He barely glanced at them before saying, "They've always been there." No, they hadn't. It wasn't just my apartment anymore. It was people. My boss, a man who had been strict but fair for the past 3 years, suddenly started calling me by a different name. "Alex," He said one morning, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Can you take care of this report? My name isn't Alex." I corrected him, laughing nervously, but he just looked at me strangely. "That's not funny," he said. I checked my ID later, just to reassure myself. It still had my real name, but when I showed it to Nate, his face twisted in confusion. "Dude," he said slowly, "that's not your name." I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. "Yes, it is." Nate shook his head. "No, man. You've always been Alex." I wanted to scream. By now, I knew better than to trust my surroundings. I stopped sleeping properly, too afraid that when I woke up, my world would be even less familiar. I memorized details, repeated my own name under my breath like a prayer. I know who I am. I know where I live. I know what's real. Then, 2 nights ago, I found something that broke me. A photo. I was cleaning, trying to distract myself, when I found it buried in a drawer. It was an old picture, slightly faded, showing a group of people at a party. I was in it, but the people around me, I had never seen them before in my life. The worst part? They were acting like we were friends. One woman had her arm around my shoulders, laughing. A man stood next to me, grinning, holding up a drink. I look happy, but I don't know who they are. And in the background of the photo, staring directly at the camera, was me. A second me standing in the distance, watching. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I don't know if there's anywhere else to go. Everything around me looks the same, but I can feel it shifting, bending into something that isn't mine anymore. People remember me wrong. My belongings aren't quite right. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the mirror, I swear, it blinks at me before I do. I moved into the new apartment on a sunny September afternoon, thrilled by the prospect of a fresh start. The building was modest. Old brick with creaking wooden floors and a courtyard that still held the scent of spring blossoms. I spent the first week arranging my belongings, relishing every moment of a life that finally felt like mine. Everything was perfectly normal, almost comforting in its predictability. However, on my 8th day, I noticed something peculiar. Returning from work, I opened the door to find my favorite armchair, which I was sure I'd left against the wall, now sitting in the center of the living room. I blinked hard, convinced I must have moved it in a moment of absent-mindedness. Yet deep inside, a small seed of doubt was planted. The next evening, as I prepared dinner in my small, familiar kitchen, I glanced toward the table where I always left a bowl of fruit. To my astonishment, the bowl was gone, replaced by a handwritten note in neat script. "Not what you left behind." My heart pounded, and I wondered if a prankster had slipped in, but no one in the building had a motive for such mischief. Over the following days, the changes grew subtler, yet more unnerving. The rug that covered the hardwood floor would shift slightly overnight, aligning itself in a new direction. A vase I remembered placing on the side table was now perched on the mantel, its flowers wilted despite being freshly bought the day before. At work, I started noticing similar oddities. My office cubicle, once a sanctuary of routine, began to look different. A coffee mug that I always arranged precisely on the desk was now found in the break room. Conversations with colleagues occasionally turned to strange topics, remarks about the changes or the reset that I couldn't place. When I mentioned my own observations, they smiled politely and dismissed it as a quirk of the building or my own tired imagination. But the more I questioned, the more I began to notice the inconsistencies. One evening, after a particularly long day, I returned home and locked the door behind me with an uneasy feeling tugging at my mind. I sat in my living room, watching a muted television show, when I saw it, a shadow moving behind the couch. I paused the show and walked slowly toward it, but nothing was there. I found no sign of an intruder, only an inexplicable chill. Then, a week later, I discovered an envelope tucked beneath my door. Inside, a single line read, "Everything is not as it seems." I couldn't recall seeing anyone in the hallways who might have slipped it under, and when I mentioned it to a neighbor, they insisted they'd never noticed any oddities at all. As days turned into a blur of recurring routines and subtle alterations, I began to meticulously document everything in a journal. I recorded the precise position of every piece of furniture, the order of objects on my shelves, the exact time I left and returned each day. Yet each time I checked, I found discrepancies. One morning, the clock on the wall had advanced inexplicably by several minutes. Another day, the pattern on the wallpaper seemed to twist just slightly, as though an extra design had been overlaid without my permission. I even began to see the same stranger, a man with tired eyes and an ambiguous smile, standing in the courtyard at different times, his presence as constant as it was inexplicable. My growing paranoia reached a fever pitch when I experienced what can only be described as a loop. I distinctly remember sitting in the living room on a rainy night, watching the steady patter of droplets against the window. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of calm. Later, as if drawn by fate, I returned to the same room, expecting the same serenity, only to find the entire arrangement of the room subtly altered. The couch was rotated to face the door instead of the window, and on the table lay a photograph of a place I had never seen. I questioned whether my memory was failing me, or if the apartment itself was somehow rewriting reality. One sleepless night, I sat on my bed, staring at the ceiling as I replayed every anomaly in my mind. The changes had become so frequent and precise that I no longer felt in control of my own space. I wondered if I was trapped in an endless loop, if every day I returned to a version of my apartment that was slightly different from the last, like an imperfect simulation of reality. I began to suspect that my life was being manipulated by some unseen force, that every small alteration was part of a larger, systematic glitch in the fabric of existence. I tried to explain it to friends and family, but their responses were always the same. It's just your imagination. They insisted nothing had changed, that my apartment, my job, even my memories were exactly as they should be. Yet I knew what I had seen. I realized that I wasn't just an observer of these glitches. I had become entangled in them. I started to feel as though I was caught in an alternate reality, one where the rules of time and space were mutable, where every familiar detail could be rewritten without warning. Now, as I write these words in a journal that might tomorrow be different from what it was today, I am left with a terrifying thought. Perhaps the world I once knew was merely an illusion, a carefully constructed facade that can be altered at a whim. I have reached the unsettling conclusion that I am trapped in a closed loop, a glitch in the matrix that I cannot escape. Every time I return to my apartment, every time I step back into the routine of my life, the environment shifts imperceptibly, leaving me to wonder if reality is something that can be controlled or if it is breaking down before my eyes. And as I stare into the darkness tonight, I realize with mounting dread that nothing is truly constant anymore. My world, my memories, even my very self, are all part of this ever-changing, inexplicable anomaly. I woke up one ordinary morning, the sound of my alarm clock pulling me from sleep. I stretched and sat up, rubbing my eyes, expecting nothing more than the usual start to another day. Yet as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I noticed something odd. My bedside lamp, which I was certain I'd always placed on the right, now sat on the left. I paused, blinking in confusion, but shrugged it off as a trick of my tired mind. I went about my routine, showering, dressing, and heading to the kitchen to brew my coffee. As I opened the cupboard for my favorite mug, I saw it was not where it normally belonged. Instead of the usual top shelf, it was nestled on a lower shelf, among cups I didn't remember owning. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Perhaps I had rearranged things in a half-asleep haze. I dismissed it, though a subtle tension began to knot in my chest. On my drive to work, the rain had softened the world into a blur of reflections and muted colors. I passed the familiar park where I often jogged on weekends, and that's when I noticed something truly unsettling. A man walking his dog, dressed in a coat identical to one I'd seen the day before, at precisely the same spot by the oak tree. I slowed down, certain it was a coincidence. But as I reached my office building and stepped out of my car, I saw the same man again, leaning against the wall near the entrance. His eyes met mine for a split second before he turned and disappeared into the building. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen him already, yet every detail of his appearance was etched in my memory. At work, everything seemed to run normally until lunchtime. In the break room, I reached for my usual sandwich from the fridge, only to find that someone had replaced it with an identical one, but with a slight variation in the mustard packet's placement. I asked a coworker if they had seen anything unusual, but they shrugged and said, "Must be your imagination." Throughout the day, small details kept shifting imperceptibly. A stapler on my desk slightly off-center, a post-it note that wasn't there the day before. Even the pattern of the floor tiles under my feet appeared to shimmer momentarily as I walked by. By the time I left the office, a nagging sense of repetition and dissonance had crept into every thought. I took my usual route home, but on one stretch of the sidewalk, I was startled to see a storefront I knew well, the little corner deli I'd passed 1,000 times, now sporting an unfamiliar neon sign in a color I'd never seen. Its window display was rearranged, with items placed in a new order, as if the universe had subtly rewritten the script of my day. I called my phone to check the time, only to see that it flickered briefly before displaying the correct hour, but I couldn't help thinking that something was off. Over the next few weeks, these glitches became increasingly frequent. At home, I began to notice objects subtly shifting positions when I wasn't looking. My favorite book, always on the coffee table, would appear on the shelf the next morning. I'd step into the living room and, for an instant, swear that the pattern on the rug had changed, the design rearranged into something unrecognizable. I started keeping a mental log, trying to track every minor discrepancy, every repeated encounter with people or places that shouldn't have repeated. The more I observed, the more the line between what I remembered and what I saw began to blur. The most unnerving moment came one evening as I sat on my couch, watching TV. I glanced at the wall clock, something that had never bothered me before, and noticed the minute hand was not moving smoothly. It jerked forward in erratic, almost mechanical increments. I paused the program and stared at the clock for several minutes, my mind racing. Had I ever noticed that before? I couldn't remember. It felt as if time itself were glitching, skipping beats in a pattern that defied logic. Gradually, I began to adapt to these anomalies. They became so commonplace that I no longer reacted with shock, but with a quiet resignation. I learned to expect the unexpected, a misplaced mug here, a duplicate face in the crowd there, and even started to find a bizarre comfort in the predictable unpredictability. Yet every time I tried to mention these events to friends or coworkers, I was met with polite smiles or gentle dismissals. "It's just your imagination," they said. "Everything's normal." But I knew what I saw. One rainy evening, while I was leaving a friend's apartment, I stepped into the hallway and caught sight of my own reflection in a mirror. For a split second, the reflection winked at me, a deliberate, knowing gesture that I couldn't attribute to muscle twitch or fatigue. My heart pounded as I looked away, questioning if my eyes were playing tricks on me. That night, as I lay in bed, the glitches continued unabated. In the darkness, I could hear the soft hum of my refrigerator syncing with the creaks of the floorboards. I heard whispers of my name in the wind outside, as if reality itself were calling me to notice the cracks in its veneer. I began to wonder if I was trapped in some kind of loop, a digital error in the fabric of existence where each day was a repeated scene with minor alterations, like lines of code being rewritten before my eyes. I started to accept that I might be living in a world that had become fundamentally unstable, that the small, inexplicable changes were not coincidences, but signs of something deeper, a glitch in the matrix of reality itself. Each day, I woke up wondering if today would be the day when the anomalies became so pronounced that there would be no returning to normalcy. This morning, as I sat at my kitchen table, the mug I had used yesterday was replaced with a different one entirely. The newspaper on the counter bore a headline about a local event I had no recollection of. I sipped my coffee and stared out the window, where the rain blurred the familiar street into a watercolor of shifting shapes. In that moment, the realization hit me with a quiet, inexorable dread. I had become part of the glitch. I could no longer tell if I was living in a world that was gradually being rewritten, or if I had somehow been programmed into an endless loop of altered moments. I have no idea if I'll ever find a way back to the reality I once knew. Every day, the inconsistencies deepen, the The repetition becomes more insistent, and the boundaries between what is real and what is a mere error in the code dissolve further. I sit here, writing these words in a journal that I know might be rearranged tomorrow, wondering if I'm the only one who sees the unraveling, or if perhaps this glitch has captured more of us than we can imagine. The truth is, I'm no longer sure if I'm awake, if I'm dreaming, or if reality itself has become nothing more than an elaborate glitch, one from which I may never escape. I was leaving a late shift at a rundown diner on the outskirts of a sleepy town when I first saw him. The night was eerily quiet, with a thin mist cloaking the parking lot as I walked to my aging sedan. I remember the exact moment. Stepping away from the diner's neon glow, my mind still fogged by exhaustion, I noticed a man leaning against a flickering streetlight at the far end of the lot. He wasn't moving, just standing there with a vacant, unsettling stare hidden beneath a tattered baseball cap. At first, I assumed he was waiting for a ride or simply homeless, but something about him set off an alarm deep within me. As I approached my car, he began walking slowly in my direction. Every step was deliberate, and as he drew nearer, I could finally see his face, a gaunt, pale complexion with eyes that burned with an intensity I'd never seen before. I tried to dismiss the rising dread as mere fatigue, but when he stopped right in front of me and fixed me with a smile that never reached his eyes, my heart hammered in my chest. I fumbled for my keys and locked the door before sliding into the driver's seat. I started the engine, determined to drive away as quickly as possible. Yet, as I backed out of the lot, I saw him step off the pavement, his pace quickening as if he were chasing me. The old car groaned under a sudden burst of speed, and I found myself desperately trying to escape the mounting terror. I drove aimlessly along winding back roads, glancing in the rearview mirror at every opportunity. Every red light felt interminable, every stop sign an agonizing reminder that he might still be following. Eventually, I managed to lose him in a dense patch of trees along a twisting lane, their branches whispering secrets in the cold wind. I told myself it was a trick of my mind, a residue of a long, stressful night. But the unease would not abate. The following evening, I tried to forget the encounter by meeting a friend at a local bar. The lively chatter and clinking glasses were a welcome distraction. Yet even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside to catch a breath of fresh air, I caught a glimpse of a figure lurking in the shadows, a man in a worn jacket, half hidden in an alley behind the bar. I initially shrugged it off as a mere coincidence, but then another odd incident occurred. A stranger approached me with a disconcerting familiarity in his tone, asking if I remembered him from somewhere. His soft, almost hypnotic voice and the way his eyes seemed to bore into me sent a chill down my spine. When I replied that I didn't know him, he only smiled, an eerie, knowing smile, and muttered something about promises not kept. His words made no sense, yet they echoed in my mind long after he vanished into the crowd. In the days that followed, subtle yet disturbing details began to accumulate. My phone would receive notifications at the exact same time every night, cryptic messages composed of random numbers and symbols that I couldn't decipher. At work, a few colleagues casually mentioned incidents that I distinctly remembered differently, as if our shared memories had been altered. I started to document every anomaly in a battered notebook. Notes about misplaced items, strange sounds and empty corridors, and inexplicable coincidences that I couldn't shake off. The meticulous record, rather than reassuring me, only deepened my sense of isolation and paranoia. One night, while driving home after another exhausting shift, I saw him again. This time, he stood at a busy intersection under a sputtering street lamp, his gaze fixed on my car as I passed by. I slowed down, my pulse pounding, and for an agonizing moment, our eyes met. Behind his blank stare, I swear I caught a glimpse of something dark and vengeful, a silent promise of retribution. I slammed on the brakes, but the flow of traffic forced me to inch forward before I could pull over completely. In the brief pause, I caught his reflection in my rear-view mirror, an image that lingered for a few heartbeats before he melted into the darkness. Now, every time I venture out, even for a quick errand, I scan the surroundings with a palpable sense of dread, convinced that he could be lurking anywhere. I've shared my experience with a few close friends. While some dismiss it as the product of an overactive imagination spurred by stress, others confess to similar feelings of being followed, watched by unseen eyes in the periphery of their vision. The unsettling truth is that I can't tell if my encounter was an isolated incident or part of a larger, more disturbing pattern of behavior that haunts this town. As I sit here, writing these words in the dim light of my living room, I can still feel that cold, unyielding gaze on my back. I have no concrete answers, only a mounting suspicion that the man in the cap, the stranger with that haunting smile, might not be an anomaly at all. His presence, like a dark specter, has imprinted itself on my every thought, a constant reminder that danger can hide in plain sight. And I can't help but wonder if I'm not the only one who has experienced something like this. Somewhere out there, someone else's life may have been forever altered by a chance encounter with a stranger who shouldn't exist. And if so, it makes me fear that our paths could cross again at any moment. I first noticed something was off the day I met her. It wasn't an extraordinary meeting, a brief exchange in the hallway of our office building, but something in her manner made me pause. Her name was Elise, and she had a warm smile that contrasted with an almost imperceptible air of detachment. We talked about mundane things, the weather, our weekend plans, even a comment about the building's outdated decor. But as our conversation wound down, she mentioned something that sent a chill down my spine. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I feel like time skips moments, like I lose pieces of myself. Have you ever felt that?" I hesitated, unsure if she was joking or being serious. I admitted that I'd experienced odd gaps in memory, small things like misplacing my keys or arriving a few minutes late without knowing why. Elise just smiled, her eyes glinting in a way I couldn't quite place, and said, "Then you understand more than you think." At first, I dismissed her words as the ramblings of someone perhaps tired or quirky. But in the days that followed, inexplicable events began to occur. I would walk down the familiar corridor to my office and suddenly catch sight of a figure I recognized from a conversation days earlier. A man in a navy jacket who, I was certain, I hadn't seen before. Then, just as quickly, he would vanish into a side door. At lunch, I found myself in a conference room where the clock on the wall read a time that felt impossibly early, though I knew I had just arrived. It was as if moments were being stolen from my day, leaving behind empty gaps that I couldn't fill. I started keeping a journal, meticulously noting every strange occurrence. One entry read, 9:14 a.m., walk to the elevator. 9:20 a.m., elevator stops on the wrong floor for a moment. 9:22 a.m., arrived at office. Missing minutes? Or missing memories? At first, I believed it was just stress or a lapse in focus, but then I encountered Elise again. In the lobby, I greeted her with a cautious smile, only to see her expression change ever so slightly. Today, her hair was a lighter shade, and her eyes, once calm and welcoming, now held a flicker of urgency, as if she were trying to convey a warning without words. "Did you lose time again?" she asked, her tone both gentle and probing. I forced a laugh and said it was nothing, but her look made it clear she wasn't convinced. In the following days, I began to notice that my surroundings were subtly shifting. The layout of our break room was altered. The coffee machine, which I remembered being near the window, was now tucked away in a corner. Photographs on the walls seemed to rearrange themselves overnight, and sometimes I'd swear I heard the sound of static where there should have been silence. The most disconcerting moment came one rainy evening when I was walking home. I passed a narrow street lined with identical brick buildings, but one of them appeared different. A single window glowed with an eerie light, though I knew that building had been dark for years. I approached slowly, heart pounding, and peered through the glass. For just a split second, I saw my own reflection, but it was distorted, as if I were looking at a warped mirror. I staggered back, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the rain and my overactive mind. Over time, the glitches became part of my everyday life. I began to lose track of hours, I would be engrossed in work, only to look at the clock and find that I had been at it for far longer than I could remember. My friends mentioned events I was sure I hadn't attended. One evening, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We meet again, sooner than you think." I tried to trace it, but the sender was anonymous, and the message left me with an unsettling sense of déjà vu. Elise continued to appear, but each encounter felt different. Sometimes she was calm and collected, other times anxious and distant. Her voice would sometimes distort, as if layered with echoes, and I began to suspect that she too was caught in this shifting reality. One night, I stayed late at the office to work on a project, and as I left the building, I took the same route home that I always did. The streetlights flickered erratically, and shadows seemed to stretch in impossible ways. I reached the corner where I'd previously seen the mysterious navy-jacketed man, and there he was again, standing under a flickering neon sign. I approached him, but as soon as I was within a few steps, he turned and vanished, leaving behind only the echo of a whispered phrase. "It's all a glitch." The words reverberated in my mind long after I resumed my walk, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently. At home, the anomalies crept into my personal space. I'd return to my apartment to find objects misplaced, pictures turned upside down, and even my own diary entries appearing with slight modifications. I began questioning whether my memories were my own, or if they were being rewritten by an unseen force. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat to find the pages of my journal blank, except for a single line in a handwriting I didn't recognize. "You are part of the anomaly now." It was then that the realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. All these glitches, the lost time, the shifting objects, the inconsistent encounters with familiar faces, weren't just coincidences or figments of a stressed mind. They were part of something larger, something that defied the rules of normal existence. I was caught in a loop, a recurring error in the fabric of reality, and every day it grew more pronounced. I had begun to see the world as a series of broken snapshots, each one slightly altered from the one before, like a film reel that had skipped a frame. Now, as I sit here writing in my journal, if it's still mine, I can't help but feel that the reality I once knew was nothing more than an illusion. Each glitch, each inexplicable event, has chipped away at the solidity of the world around me, until all that remains is a patchwork of memories and moments that may have never truly existed. I'm not sure if I've become a victim of some cosmic error, or if I've been woven into this malfunctioning tapestry by design. All I know is that I'm no longer certain of anything. The faces of those I once trusted now seem like flickering projections on a faulty screen, and I wonder if, somewhere deep down, I've lost control of my own narrative. I realize now that I may never return to the normalcy I once took for granted. I am part of the glitch, a stray line of code in a world that's breaking apart around me. And with each passing day, as the boundaries between what is real and what is merely an echo of a fractured memory blur into nothingness, I am left with a single, unsettling truth. The world I see is not fixed, and neither am I. I moved into my new apartment on a cool autumn evening, eager for a fresh start in a modest, older building with creaking wooden floors and a quiet charm. For the first few days, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I arranged my few belongings with care, setting my favorite mug on the small kitchen table and hanging a framed photograph in the living room. I believed that over time, I would come to love every nook of this new space. But about a week later, I noticed something odd. When I returned from work, my keys and wallet, which I was sure I'd left on the table, were missing. I searched every room, only to find them later in a spot I never recalled placing them, a low shelf in the hallway. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness and tried to convince myself I must have forgotten, but a nagging unease settled over me. The next morning, while preparing breakfast, I discovered that the bowl of fruit I left on the counter had been replaced by a different arrangement. A single apple placed precisely in the center, with no explanation for the change. My favorite mug was back on the table, exactly as before, yet I distinctly remembered moving it somewhere else the previous day. As the days passed, more subtle discrepancies began to pile up. A book I had left open on the coffee table was now closed and neatly stacked with others on a shelf. The patterned rug in the living room seemed slightly misaligned compared to the day before. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall would occasionally skip a beat, as if time itself hesitated for a moment. I started keeping a journal to document every incident, hoping to find a logical explanation. I wrote down the positions of objects, the order of my daily routines, the precise times I left and returned home. Yet every entry revealed small, inexplicable alterations. One morning, I awoke to find a series of unfamiliar scratches on the wooden door frame, a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like a cryptic message etched by an unseen hand. I took photos and compared them with my memory of an untouched home, but nothing I did could restore the original order. At work, the feeling of disorientation only deepened. My cubicle, once a stable refuge of routine, began to betray me. Items I was certain I had arranged in a specific order would appear in slightly different positions the next day. Conversations with coworkers occasionally veered into strange territory. One colleague casually remarked that the break room had been rearranged overnight, and another mentioned that they felt as though time had shifted on them. When I mentioned my own observations, I was met with polite smiles and assurances that I was simply stressed. But I knew what I saw. One particularly unsettling evening, I returned home in the pouring rain and found my front door ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, half expecting an intruder. Instead, everything seemed in order, except for one detail. On the kitchen counter lay a folded slip of paper with a single line in shaky handwriting. "It's only the beginning." I stared at it, terrified and confused. Yet when I tried to show it to the building manager the next day, he dismissed it as a prank or a mistake. No one else had experienced anything out of the ordinary. As the weeks wore on, the glitches grew more disturbing. One night, I awoke to the sound of soft dragging near my bedroom door. In the dark, I could just make out faint, deliberate scratches moving along the wood before everything fell silent. The next day, I found muddy footprints in the hallway outside my door. Footprints that ended abruptly at a wall, as if the person had vanished mid-step. I began to wonder if these occurrences were somehow connected, if my apartment itself was being manipulated by some unseen force. The more I tried to understand, the more I felt that the disturbances were part of a larger, unexplainable picture. Every effort to discuss them with friends or co-workers was met with disbelief or casual dismissal. I even asked my neighbors if they'd noticed anything unusual, but they insisted that everything was as it should be. Their indifference only deepened my isolation, making me question whether I was the only one who perceived these shifts. One night, unable to sleep and desperate for answers, I sat in the dim light of my living room, watching the steady drip of rain from the window. In that quiet, I noticed something that froze me in place, a flash of movement behind the mirror hanging on the wall. I spun around, but nothing was there. The room looked exactly as I had arranged it, yet the sensation that I was being watched lingered like a cold whisper. I began to suspect that the glitches were not mere coincidences or figments of an overactive imagination. They were deliberate changes, signs that reality was being altered piece by piece. Now, as I write these words by the light of a flickering lamp, every shadow and creak in my apartment fills me with dread. I no longer trust the solidity of my surroundings. The everyday objects I once took for granted now serve as constant reminders that something is amiss. Am I losing my grip on reality? Or is there a far more sinister force at work, rewriting my world without my consent? I cannot say for sure, and every attempt to seek help is met with indifferent smiles or gentle reassurances that nothing has changed. In the silence of the night, when the world is reduced to whispers and shifting shapes, I am left with a single, haunting thought. Perhaps the order I once knew was nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed facade that can be dismantled at any moment. I fear that I have become ensnared in a web of inexplicable events, trapped in a place where every small glitch points to a truth too vast to comprehend. And as I lay awake, the memory of that handwritten note echoing in my mind, I am haunted by the possibility that something far darker than simple coincidence is orchestrating these changes. Whether it's my perception playing cruel tricks on me or a hidden force altering reality itself, I am left with the unsettling realization that I may never truly know the truth.